Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a mystery, one of those strange, unsettling stories from history that seems to have no neat and tidy solution, no satisfying final chapter. We're heading back to the late 1500s, to a sliver of land on the coast of what is now North Carolina, to talk about the Lost Colony of Roanoke. It's a story of incredible ambition, of remarkable resilience, and of a disappearance so total, so complete, that it's haunted historians and storytellers for over 400 years. It's the story of over 100 men, women and children who, in the grand scheme of things, simply walked off the world stage and vanished into thin air. As always, if you enjoy these little late-night history sessions, if you find them relaxing or interesting, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It really is just me here, talking into a microphone in the quiet of the evening, and knowing you're out there listening makes it all worthwhile, and I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to think of us as this quiet, global community, all settling down for the night. So, if you feel up to it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are. But that's enough of that. The real reason we're here is to get you settled and ready for sleep, so now is the time to do just that. Turn down the lights, maybe pull the blankets up a little higher, adjust your pillow one last time, take a slow, deep breath, and let it out. Let the noise of your day begin to fade away, and allow yourself to drift back with me, across the centuries to a time of wooden ships and uncharted waters. Let's begin our journey. Chapter 1. An Elizabethan Gamble, the New World, on the edge of a map. To really understand the mystery of what happened at Roanoke, we can't just show up on the beach in 1587 and start looking for clues. That's like starting a novel on the last page. The story of Roanoke doesn't begin on that sandy, wind-swept island. It begins thousands of miles away, in the noisy, smoky and ruthlessly ambitious heart of London, in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. Imagine England in the late 16th century. It's not the globe-spanning British Empire of later years, not even close. In the grand European schoolyard of the 1580s, England is the scrappy, clever, but slightly undersized kid, the real playground bully. The undisputed heavyweight champion of the world is Spain, Catholic Spain, under the deeply pious and fantastically wealthy King Philip II. Spain had, for lack of a better term, won the lottery. A few decades earlier, they had stumbled upon the unimaginable wealth of the Americas. Gold and silver flowed from the mines of Peru and Mexico, pouring into Spanish coffers in quantities that boggled the mind. This wealth funded massive armies, a formidable navy, the famous Spanish Armada, and a global empire that stretched from the Philippines to the Netherlands. Spain was the world's first true superpower, and they were using their power to enforce their vision of a Catholic Europe. And then there was England, Protestant England, a little island nation that had thumbed its nose at the Pope and the Catholic Church. To Philip II, England wasn't just a rival, it was an island of heretics, a thorn in the side of his divine mission, and Queen Elizabeth I was the heretic-in-chief. The tension between these two nations wasn't just a political squabble, it was a cold war, simmering with religious fury and existential dread. Every shadow in the English Channel could be a Spanish spy ship. Every political rumour whispered of assassination plots and invasion plans. The air was thick with it. So, if you're Elizabeth, and you're sitting on your throne in London, you're looking at a map of the world that is increasingly painted Spanish gold. They control the south of the New World. They control the trade routes. They have all the money. What are you supposed to do? You can't compete with their armies head-on. You can't match their wealth. You have to be smarter. You have to be faster. You have to be willing to take risks. And this is where the English developed a national policy that we might politely call aggressive entrepreneurship, or, less politely, state-sponsored piracy. Elizabeth gave her blessing, and a piece of paper called a letter of marque, to daring sea captains like Sir Francis Drake. These men were known as privateers, which is just a fancy word for a pirate with good paperwork. Their job was to sail into the Caribbean, find a big, slow Spanish treasure galleon laden with Peruvian silver, and, well, relieve them of their cargo for the good of the English crown. And they were spectacularly good at it. When Drake returned from his circumnavigation of the globe in 1580, his ship, the Golden Hind, was so weighed down with Spanish loot that its waterline was dangerously low. The treasure he brought back was worth more than the entire annual income of the English government. It was an economic bailout and a massive poke in the eye to Spain all in one. But piracy, however profitable, isn't a long-term strategy. It's risky, it's reactive. What England desperately needed was a foothold. They needed a permanent base in this new world, a place from which they could launch their privateering raids more effectively, a place to repair their ships, and perhaps, just perhaps, a place where they might find some wealth of their own. They were suffering from a severe case of geopolitical FOMO, fear of missing out. Spain had this vast American continent, and England had nothing. They were stuck on the sidelines, watching their rival get stronger every year. The idea of planting a colony in North America, somewhere north of the Spanish-controlled territories in Florida, began to look less like a daydream and more like a strategic necessity. This is the world that gives birth to the Roanoke venture. It wasn't born from a gentle desire to explore. It was born from a cold, hard cocktail of fear, greed, and national pride. It was a strategic move in a global chess match against an opponent who seemed to hold all the best pieces. Now, a grand idea like colonizing a new continent needs more than just a strategic motive. It needs a champion. It needs a promoter, a venture capitalist, someone with the vision, the connections, and the sheer audacity to make it happen. And in Queen Elizabeth's court, that man was Sir Walter Raleigh. If you were to invent the perfect Elizabethan courtier, you would probably invent someone very much like Walter Raleigh. He was brilliant. He was handsome, dashing, a soldier, a poet, a scholar, and a master of courtly flattery. Legend has it he once threw his own expensive cloak over a puddle so the Queen wouldn't muddy her shoes, a story that's probably not true, but it perfectly captures his public image. He was the ultimate Renaissance man, oozing with charisma and ambition. Raleigh was one of the Queen's favourites, a position that came with immense influence and wealth, but was also incredibly precarious. To stay in the Queen's good graces, you had to constantly prove your worth. You had to be witty, you had to be useful, you had to bring her glory, and Raleigh saw North America as his grand project, his ticket to immortality and unimaginable fortune. He became obsessed with the idea. He poured his own money into it. He cajoled his wealthy friends to invest, and he used his silver tongue to convince the Queen that this was a gamble worth taking. It's important to remember, though, Raleigh was the CEO, not the guy on the ground. Elizabeth, for all her fondness for him, forbade him from going himself. He was too valuable, and perhaps too handsome, to risk on a dangerous transatlantic voyage. So while his name is forever linked with Roanoke, he never set foot there. He was the visionary, the project manager, watching from his office in London, thousands of miles away. To actually get the ships across the ocean and establish a military presence, Raleigh needed a different kind of man. He needed someone tough, experienced, and utterly ruthless. For that, he turned to his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville. Grenville was no poet. He was a hardened sailor and a soldier, known for his ferocious temper and his iron will. There's a famous, if slightly terrifying, story about him. During a dinner with some captured Spanish captains, to show them how tough the English were, Grenville supposedly took a wine glass, crushed it in his teeth, and swallowed the shards of glass, blood pouring from his mouth, all without flinching. Whether it's true or not, it tells you everything you need to know about his reputation. He was the kind of man you sent to get a difficult job done, and you didn't ask too many questions about his methods. He was the muscle of the operation, the one tasked with leading the first fleet to Roanoke in 1585 and establishing a military fort. His job was to secure the beachhead, intimidate the locals, and establish English dominance. He was, in modern terms, the COO, focused on brutal logistics and implementation. So you have the strategist in Raleigh and the enforcer in Grenville. But this Elizabethan age was not just about cold calculation and brute force. It was also an age of profound wonder, mysticism, and what we would today call pseudoscience. And to understand the intellectual and spiritual justification for this venture, we have to look at one of the strangest and most brilliant figures in Elizabeth's court, Dr. John Dee. Dim was the Queen's official astrologer and scientific advisor. He was a polymath, a genius who owned the largest private library in England. He was a master of mathematics, cartography, and navigation. He was also a practicing magician who believed he could communicate with angels through a crystal ball to unlock the secrets of the universe. To our modern minds, this sounds like a bizarre contradiction, but for the Elizabethans, science and magic were not separate fields. They were two sides of the same coin, two different ways of trying to understand the hidden workings of God's creation. Dim was the one who provided the intellectual framework for English expansion. He was the one who coined the term British Empire. He looked at ancient myths, at obscure prophecies, at his angelic conversations, and at the latest maps, and he wove them all together into a grand vision. He argued that England had an ancient divine right to North America, a claim that went back to King Arthur and a mythical Welsh prince named Modoc, who had supposedly sailed there centuries before Columbus. He provided Raleigh and the Queen with a kind of mystical manifest destiny. This wasn't just a land grab for profit. It was the fulfillment of a divine plan for England. It gave the entire enterprise a veneer of intellectual and even spiritual legitimacy. So we have this potent mixture of motivations: geopolitical fear of Spain, economic hunger for new wealth, the personal ambition of men like Raleigh, the military might of men like Grenville, and the mystical scientific justification provided by men like John Dee. All of these currents were swirling together in London, pushing England out across the Atlantic. But what were they pushing towards? What did they even think was out there? For the average Elizabethan, the New World was a place of profound and terrifying mystery. It was literally at the edge of the known world. The maps of the time were a strange blend of stunning accuracy and wild fantasy. The coastlines might be roughly correct, but the interiors were often left blank, or worse, filled with illustrations of sea monsters, headless men with faces on their chests, and all manner of mythical beasts. It was a place where the normal rules of the world might not apply. On the one hand, it was a place of incredible promise. The propaganda campaign launched by Raleigh and his supporters was in full swing. They published pamphlets and reports painting North America as a new Eden, a paradise on earth. They spoke of land so fertile that you could grow 3 crops a year with minimal effort. The forests were teeming with game, the rivers choked with fish. The natives, they claimed, were gentle, welcoming souls who would be eager to trade valuable goods for English trinkets, and even more eager to embrace Christianity. And of course there was the ever-present rumour of gold. Just like the Spanish had found their mountains of silver, surely, somewhere in the forests and hills of this new land, the English would find theirs. It was a powerful, intoxicating dream. On the other hand, it was a place of deep-seated fear. The ocean itself was a terrifying barrier. The Atlantic was called the Ocean Sea, or the Green Sea of Darkness, and for good reason. A voyage across it was a brutal, life-threatening ordeal that could take months. The ships they used were shockingly small. We think of these grand galleons, but most of the vessels in the Roanoke fleets, ships like the Tiger or the Dorothy, were tiny. Imagine a boat not much bigger than a modern city bus, crammed with 100 men plus all their supplies, livestock like chickens and pigs and cannons. Now let's just take a moment to imagine the sensory experience of that voyage. You are packed shoulder to shoulder with other men, most of whom haven't bathed in weeks. The air below deck is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, seasickness, bilge water, and the manure from the animals. Your bed is a damp patch of floor, or a swinging hammock if you're lucky. Your food, day after day, is hardtack, a biscuit baked so hard it was practically fossilized, often infested with weevils and salted meat or fish that was borderline rancid from the day you set sail. The water, stored in wooden casks, would quickly grow slimy and foul. Disease, like scurvy or dysentery, was rampant and could sweep through a ship's crew with terrifying speed. And all the while, the ship is in constant motion. The relentless creaking and groaning of the wooden hull, the snap of the sails, the roar of the wind, the crash of waves against the planks just inches from your head. And then there were the storms. An Atlantic storm in a small wooden ship was not just an inconvenience, it was a near-death experience. Imagine being tossed about in a wooden box, waves as tall as hills crashing over the deck, the sky black, the wind screaming. It's a miracle any of them made it across at all. Many didn't. To choose to undertake such a journey required a level of bravery, or perhaps desperation, that is hard for us to comprehend today, as we complain about a bit of turbulence on a transatlantic flight. So this whole venture was, from the very beginning, an enormous gamble. It was a 16th century startup, and like any startup, it needed funding. Raleigh, for all his wealth, couldn't bankroll this alone. He had to assemble a group of investors, a consortium of merchants from London, wealthy gentlemen, and other ambitious courtiers. Each of them bought a share in the Virginia enterprise, hoping for a massive return on their investment. They weren't funding a colony out of a sense of patriotic duty. They were expecting to get rich. They were hoping for a quick return. Gold, silver, valuable furs, or a new exotic crop that would be the next big thing in Europe. This put immense pressure on the colonists from day one. They weren't just settlers, they were employees of a company, and their shareholders back in London expected results, and they expected them quickly. The logistics of just getting the first expedition off the ground were staggering. They had to purchase or charter the ships, They had to hire the captains and the crews. They had to recruit the colonists themselves, mostly soldiers for that first trip, men who knew how to fight. Then they had to provision the ships for months at sea, and for the first year of the colony. This meant calculating and purchasing literal tons of supplies, barrels of gunpowder, lead for bullets, cannons, swords, armor, tools for building, saws, axes, hammers, nails, fishing nets, farming implements, seeds for crops they hoped to plant, and then all the trading goods they planned to use with the Native Americans: copper kettles, beads, bells, knives, and cloth. Every single item, from the smallest nail to the largest cannon, had to be sourced, purchased, transported to the docks, and then carefully loaded and stowed in the cramped holds of the ships. It was a monumental undertaking, a symphony of logistics, all coordinated without the benefit of telephones, email, or spreadsheets. It was all done with handwritten letters carried by messengers on horseback. The potential for error, for delay, for a critical item to be forgotten, was enormous. And so, in the spring of 1585, after years of planning, plotting, and fundraising, the first fleet was ready. 7 ships, commanded by the formidable Sir Richard Grenville, carrying around 600 men, most of them soldiers and sailors, set sail from Plymouth, England. Their destination was a place they knew only from the reports of a reconnaissance mission Raleigh had sent out the year before, a place the local Algonquian people called Roanoke. Their mission was clear, at least on paper: sail across the Atlantic, find a suitable defensible location for a settlement, build a fort, establish friendly relations with the natives if possible, but be prepared for hostility, and most importantly, start looking for a source of immediate profit. The investors were waiting. The Queen was watching. The Spanish were, as always, a looming threat. The weight of a nation's ambition rested on the creaking timbers of those 7 small ships. They were the tip of the spear, the first real attempt by England to carve out a piece of the New World for itself. They were sailing off the edge of the map, into a world of both dazzling promise and unimaginable peril. No one on board, from Sir Richard Grenville down to the lowliest cabin boy, could have possibly known what awaited them. They couldn't have known about the storms that would scatter their fleet, the unforgiving coastal waters that would wreck their flagship, the complex politics of the local tribes they were about to encounter, or the slow, grinding hardship that would define their existence in this supposed paradise. They were the first chapter in a story that would end in one of history's most enduring mysteries. But as they watched the coast of England fade into the mist behind them, they were filled not with a sense of impending doom, but with the heady, dangerous optimism of men who believed they were sailing towards a golden future, towards the dawn of a new English empire. The gamble had been made, the pieces were in motion, and the long, tragic, and utterly baffling story of Roanoke was about to begin. Chapter 2: The Soldiers' Fort, the first failed colony of 1585. And that story begins not with families and farmsteads, but with soldiers and swords. It begins not with a mystery, but with a mission. Before the fabled Lost Colony of 1587, there was this first attempt, a dress rehearsal of sorts, a trial run for the grand English dream of a foothold in the New World. This was the colony of 1585, and if you think of it as a colony at all, you're already slightly missing the point. It was, first and foremost, a forward operating base, a military outpost populated by men who knew far more about the heft of a musket than the turn of a plough. Their 7 ships, under the overall command of the formidable Sir Richard Grenville, a man whose personality was a volatile cocktail of aristocratic pride and a spectacularly short fuse, finally sighted the coast of North America in late June of 1585. They had survived the long Atlantic crossing, a journey that always managed to shrink the world down to the damp, creaking confines of a wooden hull. Now before them lay the promised land, but it wasn't the majestic open harbours they might have dreamed of. Instead, they were greeted by a long, thin ribbon of sand and scrub, a barrier of islands we now know as the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It was a treacherous, shifting coastline, a place of shallow sounds and sudden shoals, guarded by the ocean's relentless surf. The local Algonquian people called it the graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. The English, in their blissful ignorance, were about to find out why. The flagship of the fleet, the Tiger, a vessel carrying the bulk of their precious, irreplaceable supplies for the coming year, ran aground while trying to navigate an inlet. The heavy ship shuddered, groaned, and then settled onto a sandbar with a sickening finality. The waves immediately went to work, pounding against its hull, salt water flooding the hold. The men scrambled to save what they could, but it was a disaster. Casks of food, salted meat, dried peas, hardtack biscuit were ruined. Barrels of gunpowder were soaked. Seeds for planting, their hope for future harvests, were contaminated beyond use. Their grand venture had quite literally hit a sandbar before it had even properly begun. It was an omen of the most unsubtle kind, the sort of divine warning that even the least superstitious sailor on board likely took note of. Here, on the shores of this beautiful, hostile paradise, we meet the men who would shape this first chapter. There was Grenville, the commander, fuming at the incompetence of his navigator and the insolence of the sea itself. He was a man of action, but his actions were often guided by a sense of personal honour, so rigid it bordered on parody. If you've ever been on a group project where one person has all the big ideas and none of the practical skills, you've met a version of Sir Richard Grenville. Then there was the man he would leave in charge as governor, Ralph Lane. Lane was a professional soldier, a veteran of the brutal wars in Ireland. He was practical, disciplined, and saw the world through the narrow lens of military strategy. He was a man tasked with building a community, but his only real expertise was in subduing enemies. He saw potential threats in every shadow, and conspiracy in every quiet conversation. He was, in short, the absolute wrong man for a diplomatic mission, which is precisely what this venture would ultimately require. And then, moving quietly among these men of war, were two very different figures. Thomas Harriot was the expedition's scientist and surveyor. He was a brilliant mind, a graduate of Oxford, an astronomer, a mathematician, and a keen observer of the natural world. His job was R&D. He was there to map the area, to study the native flora and fauna, to identify any potential resources that could make the colony profitable. He was the brains of the operation, tasked with turning this raw, unknown land into data, into something legible and exploitable for the investors back in London. His partner in this endeavour was the artist, John White. Where Harriot saw the world in numbers and classifications, White saw it in colours and shapes. With his watercolours and brushes, he was the colony's camera. His job was to create a visual record, to paint the people, the plants, the animals, the villages, to show the English public what this new world looked like, to make it real and tangible. We see this world almost entirely through the eyes of these two men, the meticulous notes of Harriot and the wonderfully detailed paintings of White. Without them, the story of this first colony would be little more than a ghost. After the ignominious grounding of the Tiger, the fleet limped its way through the Sounds and eventually found a suitable location on the northern end of Roanoke Island. It seemed ideal, defensible, sheltered from the ocean storms, and adjacent to the mainland. And so the work began. The 100 or so men, all soldiers and specialists, began to construct their home. This was not to be a charming English village of thatched roof cottages. This was a fort. Using the timber from the surrounding forests, they built a star-shaped earthwork fortification, a design popular in Europe for deflecting cannon fire, which, you have to admit, was a bit optimistic, given that the local population's most advanced projectile weapon was a bow and arrow. They called it, with a distinct lack of imagination, the fort. Inside this packed earth wall, they built a collection of small, rough-hewn cottages and storehouses. It would have been a place of constant noise and sweat. The thud of axes, the rasp of saws, the shouts of men, all set against the backdrop of a soundscape utterly alien to them. The incessant buzz of insects, the strange calls of birds, the rustle of unseen things in the dense woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine sap, damp earth, and the oppressive humidity of a Carolina summer, a humidity that decided to personally introduce itself to every single Englishman, clinging to their woolen clothes and making every movement a chore. Their mission here was twofold. A plan hatched in the boardrooms of London by men like Sir Walter Raleigh. The first objective was, essentially, state-sponsored piracy. Roanoke Island was perfectly positioned to serve as a base for privateering. English ships could hide in the Sounds, then dash out to raid the Spanish treasure fleets as they sailed up the coast from the Caribbean, their holds laden with gold and silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru. It was a get-rich-quick scheme on a geopolitical scale. They were there to build a pirate cove with the Queen's blessing. The second objective was resource prospecting. This was Harriot and White's department. They were to explore the mainland, search for gold or silver, identify valuable commodities like rare woods or medicinal plants, and, most importantly, find a deep-water passage to the Pacific Ocean. The English still clung to the hope that North America was just a rather inconveniently large island, and that a quick route to the riches of China lay just beyond the next river bend. Spoiler alert, it did not. As the fort took shape, the English began to make contact with the local inhabitants. These were the Algonquian-speaking peoples, primarily the Secatan tribe on the mainland, and a smaller group on the coast, who the English came to know as the Croatoan. Our modern image of these encounters is often clouded by myth, but John White's paintings give us an incredibly clear window. He shows us their villages, like the town of Pommy Oak, a circular cluster of longhouses built from saplings and bark, surrounded by a wooden palisade. He painted the people themselves with remarkable detail and humanity. Men with intricate tattoos and distinct hairstyles, women with leather skirts and children clinging to their backs. He shows them fishing with spears and weirs, planting corn in neat rows, and celebrating in religious ceremonies, their bodies painted and adorned with feathers. To the English soldiers, it must have been like landing on another planet, and for the Algonquian people, the arrival of these pale, bearded men in their strange metal and wool clothing, with their huge floating villages and their sticks that made thunder, must have been an event of almost supernatural significance. Initially, relations were cautious but functional. Thomas Harriot, with his boundless curiosity, set about learning the local language. Trade occurred. The English had copper pots, metal tools, and glass beads, which the natives prized for their novelty and utility. The Algonquians had food, corn, fish, pumpkins, and meat, which the English, with their supplies rotting, desperately needed. For a few weeks, a fragile balance was maintained. The Algonquians were curious about the newcomers, and the English, for their part, were dependent on their host's generosity. They were, in effect, guests. The problem was, they had no intention of ever leaving. The first real crack in this fragile relationship came in July, and it came, unsurprisingly, courtesy of Sir Richard Grenville. While exploring the mainland, Grenville and his men visited the village of Ocquaskoguk. During their stay, a small silver cup went missing. The English accused a villager of stealing it. Whether it was a genuine theft or a simple misunderstanding, we'll never know, but Grenville's reaction was swift, brutal, and catastrophically out of proportion. He returned to the village, demanded the cup's return, and when it wasn't produced, he ordered his men to burn the entire village to the ground and destroy their cornfields. Think about that for a moment. Over a single silver cup, Grenville incinerated a community's homes, and more importantly, their winter food supply. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance and cruelty. He may have thought he was teaching the savages a lesson about English power and property, but the only lesson the Algonquians learned that day was that these newcomers were unpredictable, violent, and utterly terrifying. The word would have spread like fire through the network of villages. The English were not to be trusted. The silver cup incident poisoned the well. The seeds of friendship were replaced with seeds of fear and resentment. In late August of 1585, Sir Richard Grenville decided his work was done. The fort was built, the colony was established, and he was eager to get on with the privateering part of the mission. He sailed away with the bulk of the fleet, leaving Ralph Lane and about 107 men to hold down the fort. He promised, absolutely promised, that he would return by Easter of the following year with more men and, crucially, more supplies. As the sails of his ships disappeared over the horizon, a sense of isolation must have descended upon the small garrison. They were now alone, a tiny English island in a vast and increasingly wary Algonquian sea. The autumn passed. Lane, ever the soldier, kept his men busy. He sent out exploration parties to map the surrounding area. One group, led by Lane himself, travelled north up the Chowan River, chasing rumours of a great sea and a rich native king. They pushed their boats far into the interior, their supplies dwindling, their men growing weak. The local tribes they encountered were now suspicious, often refusing to trade and melting away into the forest at their approach. The expedition found no gold, no passage to the Pacific, only hardship and hunger. They were forced to eat their own dogs to survive the journey back to Roanoke. As autumn bled into winter, the colony's situation grew more precarious. The food they had brought was nearly gone. The food ruined on the Tiger was a loss they now felt with every gnawing pang of hunger. Their attempts at farming had been a failure. They had arrived too late in the season, and besides, these were soldiers, not farmers. They were entirely dependent on the local tribes for survival. But the goodwill they might once have enjoyed had been squandered by Grenville. Trade became sparse and difficult. The Algonquians, under the leadership of their powerful chief Wingina, were beginning to see the English not as guests but as a dangerous and parasitic burden. Winter on the Outer Banks is not a gentle season. The wind comes howling in from the Atlantic, cold and damp. The sky turns a uniform, cheerless grey. For the men huddled in their crude huts, it must have been a miserable existence. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the chinks in the walls. The fire was the center of their world, the source of heat and light, but the smoke would have filled the small spaces, stinging their eyes and coating everything with a layer of soot. They were bored, they were hungry, and they were scared. Their world had shrunk to this damp, smoky little fort on the edge of nowhere. Easter came and went. There was no sign of Grenville. The horizon remained stubbornly empty. The men's hope, which had been a flickering candle through the long winter, now began to sputter and die. Desperation set in. Lane was forced to disperse his men into small groups, sending them up and down the coast to live off oysters and whatever else they could forage. The proud English soldiers who had come to conquer a continent were reduced to digging for roots and shellfish on the beach, their bellies aching with a hunger that was now constant. It was in this atmosphere of hunger and paranoia that Ralph Lane's military mind began to see plots everywhere. He became convinced that Wingina, the chief of the Roanoke tribe, was organizing a pan-tribal alliance to wipe them out. Wingina, who had moved his capital to the mainland and adopted a new name, Pemasapan, was certainly no friend of the English. He had seen their violence and their insatiable need for food. He had begun to cut off supplies, hoping to starve them into leaving. From his perspective, it was a logical strategy for dealing with a dangerous invader. From Lane's perspective, it was a declaration of war. Lane decided on a preemptive strike. He wasn't going to wait for the attack he was so certain was coming. In early June of 1586, he orchestrated a trap. He requested a meeting with Wingina on the mainland. When the chief and his advisors arrived, Lane gave a prearranged signal. The English soldiers opened fire. In the ensuing chaos, Wingina was shot. Wounded, he fled into the woods, but was pursued and killed. One of Lane's men beheaded him, and Lane himself brought the head back to the fort at Roanoke. It was a brutal, treacherous act. Lane may have recorded it in his journal as a decisive military victory that had saved the colony from annihilation. But what he had actually done was commit an act of political assassination that destroyed any last lingering chance of peaceful coexistence. He had confirmed the Algonquians' worst fears about the English. He had turned a tense and difficult situation into an openly hostile one. The colony was now surrounded by enemies of its own making. Its food supply was completely cut off, and its men were starving. They had won the battle, but in doing so they had sealed their own fate. The fort at Roanoke had become a prison, and then, just as all hope seemed lost, the sky once again delivered a miracle, or at least the sea did. A week after the murder of Wingina, a lookout spotted a massive fleet on the horizon. Not Grenville's small relief force, but something far grander. It was a fleet of 23 ships, a terrifying sight for anyone on the wrong side of England. But for the starving men at Roanoke, it was salvation. It was the fleet of Sir Francis Drake, the most famous and feared English seaman of his age, returning from a massive, hugely successful raid on Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. He was sailing home, laden with treasure and glory, and had simply stopped by Roanoke on the way to see how Raleigh's little colonial project was getting on. Drake was a man of action and good humour. He saw the pitiful state of Lane's men, thin, ragged and desperate, and offered them a generous deal. He would give them a ship, the Francis, along with enough supplies to last them another month, and 2 of his most experienced captains to help them. This would be enough to tide them over until Grenville finally arrived. It was a lifeline. Lane and his men gratefully accepted. They began loading the supplies onto the ship, their spirits soaring. They had been saved. But the Outer Banks had one last trick to play. Before they could finish, a furious storm, what the locals called a hurricane, blew in with sudden and terrifying violence. The sky turned black, the wind shrieked, and the sea rose in a mountainous rage. Drake's massive fleet was scattered, with ships forced to cut their anchors and run for the open sea to avoid being smashed to pieces on the shore. For 3 days the storm raged. When it finally blew itself out, the sea was calm again. Drake's fleet reassembled. But the Francis, the ship that held all of the colony's new supplies, and their only hope, had been blown far out to sea and was nowhere to be found. The colonists were devastated. Their salvation had been dangled in front of them and then snatched away by the wind. Drake made another offer. He could give them another ship, but it would be much larger, too large to be left behind safely. They would have to sail it home with him. He put the choice to Ralph Lane and his men. They could stay and wait for Grenville, who was now months overdue, and face the righteous fury of the tribes whose chief they had just murdered. Or they could cut their losses, abandon the first English colony in the New World, and go home. It wasn't much of a choice. The vote was unanimous. They wanted out, and so began the frantic, undignified scramble to abandon Roanoke. In their haste to get aboard Drake's ships, they left almost everything behind. Chests containing their records, Harriet's scientific notes and specimens, and most of John White's precious original drawings were either left on the shore or thrown overboard to make room for the men. It was an ignominious end to a venture that had begun with such high hopes. The would-be conquerors, the men who were supposed to establish the first foothold of a new empire, were fleeing with nothing but the tattered clothes on their backs. They had come for gold and glory, and were leaving with only their lives. Just 2 weeks later, the supply ship sent by Sir Walter Raleigh finally arrived at Roanoke. It found the fort deserted. Confused, the crew searched the island, but found no sign of the colonists. A short time after that, Sir Richard Grenville himself finally showed up with his main relief fleet. He too found the settlement empty, with no clue as to what had happened. Unwilling to give up the claim to the land entirely, Grenville made a decision that seems almost baffling in its carelessness. He left a small holding force of 15 men on the island, with enough supplies to last them for 2 years, and then he sailed back to England. 15 men, left alone in a fort surrounded by people who now had every reason to despise the English. It was not a garrison, it was a sacrifice. And so the first act of the Roanoke story came to a close. The colony of 1585 was an abject failure. It failed as a privateering base. It failed to find any gold, and it failed to establish any kind of lasting presence. All it had really succeeded in doing was creating a legacy of violence and mistrust with the native population. But it wasn't a total loss. The survivors, when they arrived back in England, brought a few things with them. They brought back valuable intelligence about the geography and resources of the region, and they brought back 2 new plants that would in time conquer Europe in a way no English army ever could: tobacco and the potato. They also brought back a story, a cautionary tale, a lesson in what not to do, a lesson that John White, who had seen his beautiful, careful work lost to the waves, must have taken to heart. He had seen this new world, and he believed in its promise. He was convinced that the English could succeed, if only they tried it a different way, not with soldiers and forts, but with families and farmers, not with conquest, but with community. He was determined to try again, and it is that second attempt, born from the ashes of this first failure, that would give birth to the real mystery of Roanoke. Chapter 3. The City of Raleigh. A new plan for a new world. And that second attempt wasn't just a minor course correction, a simple tweak to the original plan. It was a fundamental rethinking of what it meant to build a piece of England in the new world. Sir Walter Raleigh, ever the ambitious courtier and entrepreneur, sat back in his lavish London study, looked at the balance sheets from the first voyage, and likely came to a very modern conclusion. The business model was flawed. The first attempt had been a military venture, a forward operating base designed to raid Spanish shipping and establish a strategic foothold. It was staffed by soldiers, men who knew how to fight and follow orders, but who knew precious little about putting down roots. They were, in essence, employees on a difficult remote assignment, counting the days until they could go home. They expected supply drops from the Home Office, and when those were late, morale plummeted. They weren't invested. They weren't building a future for themselves. They were enduring a present for their queen and their patron. Raleigh realized, or was convinced by others like Richard Hakluyt, the great promoter of American colonization, that if you wanted to create a permanent England, you had to send the English, not just the soldiers, but the whole messy, complicated, wonderful package. You needed families. You needed people who weren't looking for a quick return on investment, but were looking to build a life. You needed farmers who would see the soil not as a temporary inconvenience, but as their future livelihood. You needed blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers. You needed women and children, because their presence would transform a temporary camp into a permanent town. A fort can be abandoned, but a home, a place where a child has been born, is something people will fight for, something they will die for. It changes the entire psychological calculus. This was to be a proper colony, a self-sustaining civilian settlement, a start-up, if you will, but one where the employees were also the primary shareholders, and the stock was their own survival. He would name it the City of Raleigh, a name full of ambition and perhaps a touch of vanity. And so the recruitment drive for this new and improved venture began. This wasn't a call for hardened soldiers itching for a fight. This was an advertisement for a dream. Imagine the town criers, the pamphlets passed around in London pubs, Tired of the damp, crowded, plague-ridden streets of London? Do you dream of owning your own land? A place where a man of humble means can become a lord of his own estate? The sales pitch was intoxicating. Every man who signed on as a planter was promised a massive grant of 500 acres of land. 500 acres to a landless tenant farmer in England. A man whose entire world might be a few rented strips of muddy field. This was like being offered a kingdom. It was a promise of autonomy, of status, of a legacy for their children. It was the American dream, before America even really knew what it was. They weren't just selling land, they were selling a vision of a new Eden. They had John White's watercolors, remember? These weren't grim depictions of a hostile wilderness. They were beautiful, vibrant images of a land of plenty, of abundant corn, strange and wonderful fruits, deer grazing peacefully, and friendly natives who seemed more curious than hostile. The brochures, had they existed, would have featured White's beautiful drawings of shimmering fish and bountiful harvests. The fine print, of course, detailing the starvation, the skirmishes, and the pervasive gnawing fear, was conveniently omitted. It was a sales job, and a remarkably successful one. Over 100 people signed up. Around 117 men, women, and children put their names down, packed what little they owned, and said goodbye to everything they had ever known. We have the list of their names, and reading it is a strangely moving experience. It's not a list of generals and admirals, it's a list of ordinary people. You see names like John Sampson, Carpenter, Thomas Smith, Weaver, William Clement, Cooper. These are the people who build things, the people who make a community function. And then you see the other names. 17 women are on the list. Names like Joyce Archard, Jane Jones, and Elizabeth Glane. And 9 children, boys who would have been running through the rigging of the ship, their minds full of adventure. At the heart of this group was a family, the family of the man chosen to be governor of this new city, John White. White wasn't just an artist and a surveyor this time. He was the leader, and he was bringing his own family, which tells you everything you need to know about his belief in this project. His daughter Eleanor was on that list. She was married to a man named Ananias Dare, a London tiler and bricklayer, a man of skill, a man of substance, and Eleanor was pregnant, deeply pregnant, to undertake a perilous months-long ocean voyage in the 16th century, while in the 3rd trimester of a pregnancy is a level of fortitude that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. We worry about turbulence on a 2-hour flight. She was facing the prospect of giving birth on a pitching, creaking wooden vessel, or worse, on the wild shores of a new continent, thousands of miles from the nearest midwife or doctor. Her presence, and the impending birth of her child, made the entire venture deeply, profoundly personal for Governor John White. This wasn't just a royal patent he was fulfilling. He was building a world for his first grandchild. The little fleet set sail from Portsmouth in May of 1587. 3 ships, the flagship, the Lion, a flyboat named the Dorothy, and a small pinnace. From the very beginning, the journey was fraught with a tension that had little to do with the waves. The commander of the fleet, the man in charge of the ships themselves, was a pilot named Simon Fernandez. He was a Portuguese sailor of immense skill and experience, but also, it seems, of immense arrogance and a profoundly difficult personality. John White was the governor of the colony, the man in charge on land. Fernandez was the master of the sea, and these 2 men, with 2 very different sets of priorities, were set on a collision course. For White and his colonists, the journey was just the necessary, uncomfortable preamble to their real lives. For Fernandez, the journey was the job. His goal was to get the colonists to the New World, and then indulge in his preferred and far more profitable pastime, privateering, hunting Spanish ships for plunder. To him, the colonists, with their boxes of seeds, their farming equipment, and their crying children, were just cargo, very precious, very demanding cargo that was getting in the way of the real business of making money. The voyage was as miserable as you can imagine. Imagine over 100 people crammed into a wooden boat that would barely qualify as a mid-sized yacht today. The space below decks would have been dark, airless and unimaginably crowded. The stench would have been overpowering. A combination of unwashed bodies, seasickness, livestock, and the foul bilge water sloshing in the bottom of the hull. The food would have been a monotonous diet of salted meat, hardtack biscuit, likely crawling with weevils, and stale beer. There was no privacy, no sanitation to speak of. It was a floating petri dish, and people were constantly ill. For weeks, then months, their entire world was this cramped, smelly, floating prison, surrounded by an endless, indifferent ocean. And all the while, the tension between Governor White and Simon Fernandez simmered. White logged in his journal, with restrained but clear frustration, how Fernandez seemed to take every opportunity to make the journey more difficult, refusing to stop for fresh water and supplies when they desperately needed them, always pushing onward, driven by his own schedule. But the most fateful decision, the one that may have sealed the colony's doom before a single house was even built, was yet to come. The plan, the entire grand strategy for this new colony, was not to return to Roanoke. Raleigh, White, and their backers knew the failings of that island. It was shallowly harbour, difficult to approach, and strategically insignificant. No, the plan was to go north, to the Chesapeake Bay. They had reports from the first expedition of the deep, safe harbours there, the wide, navigable rivers, and the more fertile land. The native peoples there were also thought to be more friendly. The city of Raleigh was intended to be founded on the shores of the Chesapeake. Their first stop in the New World was supposed to be a brief one at Roanoke. They had to pick up the 15 men that Sir Richard Grenville had left behind the previous year. The holding force meant to maintain England's claim. The plan was to collect these soldiers and then immediately sail north to their intended destination. But Simon Fernandez had other ideas. By the time they reached the treacherous Outer Banks of North Carolina in late July, the summer was well underway. The hurricane season was approaching, and Fernandez, our pilot in a hurry, was eager to get on with his treasure hunting. When they arrived at Roanoke, White took a small group of sailors and went ashore to find the garrison. The scene that greeted them was not a welcoming one. There was no sign of the fort. It had been razed to the ground. The cottages were overgrown with weeds and vines. The ground was littered with debris, and scattered among the weeds they found the first grim welcome gift from the New World, the sun-bleached bones of one of the English soldiers. It was a chilling, silent testament to the fate of the men who had been left behind. They later learned from friendly natives that the garrison had been attacked. Some were killed, and the survivors, few in number, had taken their small boat and simply vanished, sailing up into the Sounds, never to be seen again. This was a deeply ominous start. The men they had come to rescue were gone, likely dead. The place felt haunted, a site of failure and death. Shaken, White and his men returned to the ship, ready to leave this cursed island behind and proceed north to the Chesapeake as planned. And it was then that Simon Fernandez made his move. He flatly refused to take them any further. He announced to the colonists who were still aboard the ships that he was unloading them right here, right now. His excuses were flimsy. He claimed the summer was too far spent, that it was too dangerous to navigate the coast further north so late in the season. But his true motives seemed clear to a furious John White. Fernandez didn't want to waste any more time ferrying colonists around. He wanted them off his ship so he could go hunting for Spanish gold. It was a moment of absolute crisis. The colonists were essentially being marooned. They protested, they argued, they pleaded. This was not the plan. They were in the wrong place. They had no fort, no houses, and now they knew for certain that the local natives were not universally friendly. But they had no leverage. They were on Fernandez's ship, subject to his command. He held all the cards. With heavy hearts and a growing sense of dread, the 117 men, women and children of the city of Raleigh were forced to disembark. They watched as their belongings, their tools, their seeds, their hopes for a new life, were unceremoniously dumped onto the sandy, overgrown shore of Roanoke Island, the very place that had already consumed 2 English ventures, as the ships sailed away, leaving them utterly alone on the edge of a vast unknown continent. The sense of betrayal and isolation must have been profound. Their grand new beginning already felt like a recycling of an old failure. Now, their first task was what we might politely call extreme home renovation. They had to clear the ruins of the old settlement. Imagine the psychological toll of that. Every broken post, every piece of rotted timber was a reminder of the failure that had come before. They had to build cottages for over 100 people from scratch, racing against the coming of autumn. The men, led by the likes of Ananias Dare, would have set to work felling trees, trimming logs, and building simple, rough-hewn shelters. The women would have been desperately trying to create some semblance of a home, managing dwindling food supplies, tending to the sick, and trying to keep the children from wandering off into a wilderness that was proving to be far more intimidating than John White's lovely paintings had suggested. They also needed to re-establish contact with the native tribes. This was a task that required the utmost delicacy. The slate was not clean. The actions of Lane's soldiers and the fate of Grenville's garrison had soured relations considerably. They still had an ally, Manteo, who had been with them in England and was a member of the Croatoan tribe from a nearby island. He acted as their guide and mediator, but the other local tribes were deeply suspicious, if not openly hostile. They remembered the English arrogance, the violence, the summary execution of their chief, Wingina. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. An early attempt at diplomacy ended in tragedy. A colonist named George Howe decided to go off by himself, wading in the shallows to catch crabs. It was a fatal mistake. He was ambushed by a group of warriors from a tribe that Lane had previously attacked. They shot him with 16 arrows, and then, in a final, brutal act of retribution, beat his head in with a club. His mutilated body was discovered by his fellow colonists shortly after. The message was brutally clear: you are not welcome here. The peace was broken. This one act of violence plunged the small, isolated community into a state of siege. The woods, which had seemed so full of promise, were now filled with menace. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow at dusk, could be a threat. The dream of a peaceful new life was rapidly turning into a nightmare of paranoia and fear. In response, the colonists, feeling the pressure to show strength, decided on a retaliatory raid. Guided by Manteo, they planned a surprise attack on the village of the natives they believed were responsible for Howe's death. They crossed the Sound at night and stormed the village at dawn, opening fire into the flickering firelight. But in the confused pre-dawn chaos, they made a terrible discovery. They had attacked the wrong village. The people they were shooting at were not their enemies, but the remnants of Manteo's own tribe, the Croatoan, their only real allies in the region. They had been scavenging the abandoned village for leftover corn. By a miracle, no one was killed, though several were injured, but the damage was done. It was a catastrophic blunder, an act of panicked, indiscriminate violence that succeeded only in terrifying and alienating the very people they needed most. They were now truly, utterly alone, surrounded by an ocean of suspicious and hostile strangers. And yet, in the midst of all this fear and hardship, this catalogue of missteps and misfortunes, there was a moment of profound hope. On the 18th of August, 1587, less than a month after they had been unceremoniously dumped on the island, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia. The birth of a baby in any community is a cause for celebration, but for this community, it was so much more. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the New World. She was a symbol. She was a living, breathing testament to their purpose. They were not just soldiers in a fort. They were families putting down roots. She was the first root. Her cry was the first native-born English cry on a new continent. To her grandfather, Governor John White, holding this tiny baby in the middle of a hostile wilderness, she must have represented everything he was fighting for. She was the future. She was the promise that this city of Raleigh might, against all odds, survive and flourish. They christened her in a small, rough-hewn church, and for a brief moment, the colonists could feel like they were building something that would last. But the christening party couldn't last forever. The reality of their situation soon came crashing back in. Their supplies were running desperately low. The food they had brought from England was nearly gone. Because they had arrived so late in the season, their own attempts at planting crops had yielded a poor harvest. They had hoped to trade with the natives for corn, but after the bungled raid, that was no longer an option. Winter was approaching, and they knew, with a certainty that must have chilled them to the bone, that they did not have enough food to survive it. The pinnace, their one small vessel capable of making coastal voyages, had been sent back to England by a storm. They were trapped. The colonists came to a difficult, unanimous decision. Someone had to go back to England. Someone had to sail with the fleet, which was preparing to depart, and plead their case to Sir Walter Raleigh. They needed to explain the situation, the betrayal by Fernandez, their desperate lack of supplies, and arrange for a relief mission to be sent the following spring. There was only one man they trusted for the job, only one man with the status and the eloquence to make their case effectively. Their governor, John White. White refused. He refused vehemently. He had given his word that he would not leave them. He was their leader. And more than that, he was a grandfather now. His daughter Eleanor and his newborn granddaughter Virginia were here on this island. The thought of leaving them behind, even for a few months, was unbearable. He argued that it would look like he was abandoning his post, fleeing at the first sign of trouble, but the colonists were insistent. They put their pleas in writing, a formal petition, absolving him of any blame for leaving. They knew he was their only hope. Ananias Dare, his own son-in-law, likely pleaded with him. Eleanor too. Go, they would have said. Go and save us. Save your granddaughter. And so, with the heaviest of hearts, John White agreed. At the end of August, just 9 days after the birth of his granddaughter, he said his goodbyes. We can only imagine that final heartbreaking scene on the beach, him holding little Virginia one last time, promising his daughter Eleanor that he would return, promising her that he would move heaven and earth to be back by the following spring, with ships full of food and supplies. As he was rowed out to the ship, he would have watched the small figures of his family and his colonists shrink on the shore, a tiny fragile cluster of English life on the edge of a vast indifferent continent. He had absolutely no way of knowing that he would never see any of them again. He was sailing away from the greatest mystery in American history, a mystery in which his own family was about to become the central, heartbreaking figures. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Armada's Shadow, a Governor's Desperate Return. That journey back across the Atlantic must have been an exquisite form of torture for John White. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every snap of the sails in the wind, was a sound carrying him further and further away from his daughter Eleanor and his infant granddaughter Virginia. The crossing was, by all accounts, blessedly uneventful. Good weather, fair winds, the kind of voyage a sailor dreams of. But for White, the calm seas would have been a stark, almost insulting contrast to the storm of anxiety in his own heart. He was an artist, a man trained to observe details. He would have watched the shifting colours of the water, the patterns of the clouds, the slow, relentless march of the sun across the sky, and seen in all of it a clock, ticking away the finite supplies he had left behind. He had promised them he would be back. He had given his word, in the simple, brutal arithmetic of the 16th century. A promise of supplies was a promise of life itself. He likely spent his days sketching, trying to capture the subtle moods of the ocean, or perhaps reviewing his maps and drawings of the New World. It would have been a way to keep his mind occupied, to channel his worry into the familiar comfort of ink on parchment. But at night, in the close dark confines of his cabin, with the gentle rocking of the ship, a constant reminder of his movement away from his family, the doubts must have crept in. Had they stored enough grain? Was the well water clean? Were the local tribes truly as friendly as they had seemed? He was the governor. Their survival was his responsibility, a weight that surely pressed down on him more heavily than the entire Atlantic Ocean. He was sailing towards help, but leaving behind every single person he was meant to protect. When the familiar damp green shores of England finally rose over the horizon in November of 1587, his relief would have been immense. He had made it. The first, most dangerous part of his mission was complete. Now all that was left was the simple matter of logistics. He would report to his patron, the influential and ever-ambitious Sir Walter Raleigh. They would gather the supplies, charter the ships, recruit a few more hands, and he would be on his way back by the following spring. A few months of frustrating meetings and haggling in the smoky taverns and counting houses of London, and then back to Roanoke, back to his family. It was a clear, straightforward plan, and it was a plan that was about to collide with the immovable object of history. John White stepped off his ship, not into the England he had left, but into a nation holding its breath. The air was thick with more than just the usual coal smoke and river fog. It was thick with rumour, with fear, and with a kind of grim, defiant patriotism. The talk in every port, every market, every tavern was not of exploration or New World colonies, but of invasion, of Spain, of King Philip II and his supposedly invincible navy. The whispers called it the Ninth Emprise of England, a grand holy crusade to depose the Protestant Queen Elizabeth and return the country to the Catholic fold. White, a man whose entire world was focused on a tiny, fragile settlement 3,000 miles away, had just walked into the opening act of a geopolitical drama that would decide the fate of empires. His desperate little supply run had just been placed on the national waiting list, and its ticket number was somewhere in the thousands. To understand the sheer, soul-crushing impossibility of the task now facing John White, we have to understand the rivalry between England and Spain. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was personal, religious, and economic. It was the 16th century equivalent of a global superpower staring down a scrappy, disruptive startup that kept stealing its data and poaching its clients. The superpower, of course, was Spain. Under King Philip II, the Spanish Empire was the largest and most powerful in the world. Philip was a man who, to put it politely, took his job description, most Catholic king, very, very seriously. He ruled over Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and a vast, ever-expanding empire in the Americas that was a fire hose of gold and silver. pumping unimaginable wealth into the Spanish treasury. Philip saw himself as God's chosen instrument on earth, the defender of the true faith, and from his perspective, his former sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth I of England, was a heretic, an illegitimate ruler sitting on a throne that was not rightfully hers. Elizabeth's England, on the other hand, was the scrappy startup. It was a relatively small Protestant nation with a decent navy, but nothing that could stand toe-to-toe with the full might of Spain. Elizabeth was a political genius, a master of playing her enemies against each other, of delaying and deflecting. She knew she couldn't win a conventional war with Spain, so she did what any good disruptive company does. She innovated. Her innovation was a new form of maritime warfare, a kind of plausible deniability on the high seas. She sponsored a generation of brilliant, daring and utterly ruthless sailors who came to be known as the Sea Dogs. Men like John Hawkins and, most famously, Sir Francis Drake. To the English, they were heroes, swashbuckling adventurers who tweaked the nose of the Spanish king and brought home chests of treasure. To the Spanish, they were something else entirely. They were pirates, Lutheran pirates, which was somehow even worse. They were what we might today call state-sponsored actors. Think of Sir Francis Drake, less as a naval officer, and more as a freelancer with a letter from the CEO that said, "You are authorized to raid our main competitors' shipping, cripple their supply lines, and steal everything that isn't nailed down. If you get caught, we'll deny everything. If you succeed, you'll be knighted." And succeed they did. Drake's raids were breathtakingly audacious. He didn't just pick off a stray Spanish merchant ship here or there. He sailed into the heart of the Spanish Main, sacking ports, looting treasure houses, and in one legendary feat, capturing a treasure galleon so laden with silver that it took his crew 6 days just to transfer the cargo. It was a massive blow to the Spanish economy, and an even bigger blow to Spanish pride. Every ounce of silver that Drake brought back to England was an ounce that Philip couldn't use to pay his armies. It was economic warfare, and it was infuriatingly effective. Philip, a man not known for his sense of humour, was not amused. He sent angry letters to Elizabeth, demanding she punish Drake and return the stolen treasure. Elizabeth would smile, send back a polite, non-committal reply, and then promptly knight Drake on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, using a sword that the Spanish ambassador was forced to watch her wield. It was the ultimate power move, a diplomatic slap in the face. This simmering Cold War had been going on for years, but in 1587, just as White was making his way back to England, the final straw broke. Elizabeth, after years of hesitation, finally ordered the execution of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was a Catholic, and in the eyes of Catholic Europe, the legitimate heir to the English throne. As long as she was alive, Philip had hoped that England might peacefully return to Catholicism upon Elizabeth's death. But with Mary's execution, that hope was extinguished. For Philip, it was a personal affront and a divine signal. The time for diplomacy was over. The heretic queen had murdered a rightful Catholic monarch. The enterprise of England was no longer just a strategic option. It was a holy obligation. This was the world John White stepped into. A world where Sir Walter Raleigh, his patron, was not focused on his struggling American colony, but on his role as captain of the Queen's Guard and Vice Admiral of Devon and Cornwall. His primary job was now organising the coastal defences of England against the single greatest naval threat the country had ever faced. White's request for a few ships and some barrels of hardtack must have sounded like someone asking for a cup of sugar during an air raid. Raleigh, to his credit, seems to have tried. He understood the stakes at Roanoke, but his hands were tied. In early 1588, as the final preparations for the Armada were being reported by English spies, Queen Elizabeth and her Privy Council made a fateful decision. They issued a general stay of shipping. It was a national lockdown. No vessel of any significant size, capable of being armed and used for defence, was permitted to leave any English port. Every ship, every sailor, every cannon was requisitioned for the defence of the realm. The entire maritime capacity of the nation was being mobilised for a single purpose: survival. Imagine John White's position. He had the funds from Raleigh. He had the list of supplies. He could probably walk down to the London docks and see dozens of ships perfectly suited for his voyage, sitting idle at anchor, but he couldn't have them. They were all on government hold. He was a man with a house key, standing on the sidewalk, watching as his house is boarded up by a military emergency crew. He could plead, he could argue, he could show them his commission as governor, but the answer was always the same: nothing sails until the Spanish threat is dealt with. The weeks turned into months. The spring of 1588 arrived, the very season he had promised he would return, and he was still in England, trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. We can picture him, haunting the corridors of power, a man out of his element. He was an artist, a cartographer, a man of the quiet observational world. He was not a courtier skilled in navigating the treacherous currents of Elizabethan politics. He was a father and a grandfather, desperate to fulfill a promise, caught in the gears of a vast war machine he could not control. Every report of a Spanish ship being sighted, every rumour of the Armada's movements, would have been a fresh twist of the knife. The national crisis was his personal prison. He and Raleigh did manage one small, desperate gambit. The stay of shipping applied to large vessels fit for war, but what about very small ones? They managed to acquire 2 small pinnaces, the Brave and the Roe. These were little more than coastal boats, completely inadequate for a solo Atlantic crossing, and for carrying the amount of supplies the colonists truly needed. But they were something. It was a high-risk shoestring operation, a last-ditch effort to get something to Roanoke. White was not to sail with them. He was deemed too important, and the journey too risky for the governor. Instead, the boats were placed under the command of a man named Arthur Facey. The plan was simple: sail directly to Roanoke, drop off the supplies and a few new men, and get back. But the sea in wartime is a tempting place. The captains of the 2 small ships, perhaps knowing this was their only chance for profit, were overcome by a bout of opportunistic greed. They had letters of marque which gave them permission to attack enemy shipping. Instead of making for the open Atlantic, they decided to engage in a little light piracy on the side. They chased after some Spanish ships, hoping for a quick prize. It did not go well. They ended up in a brutal fight with French ships off the coast of Morocco, who were not at all impressed with their English bravado. The pinnaces were overwhelmed, their crews killed or wounded, and their cargo, the precious food and supplies meant for the colonists, was looted. The battered ships limped back to England, their mission a catastrophic failure. For John White, this news must have been devastating. It was a disaster born of foolishness and greed. The one tiny crack of light he had seen had been slammed shut. His one desperate attempt had not only failed, it had ended in bloodshed and disgrace, and worst of all, it had wasted precious, irreplaceable time. Meanwhile, the main event was about to begin. In May of 1588, the Gran Armada Felicissima, the great and most fortunate navy, finally set sail from Lisbon. The scale of it was almost beyond comprehension. 130 ships, galleons, carracks, galleasses armed with massive oars, nearly 30,000 men, soldiers, sailors, priests. It was a floating city, a mobile invasion force designed to sweep the English navy from the Channel, land a massive army on the coast of Kent, and march on London. It was, in Philip's eyes, an invincible crusade, blessed by the Pope himself. From the cliffs of Dover, the English watched it arrive. It moved up the Channel in a vast, tight crescent formation, 7 miles from tip to tip. It was designed to be unbreakable, a floating fortress that the smaller, more nimble English ships couldn't penetrate, and for days they couldn't. The English ships, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham and his Vice-Admiral, Sir Francis Drake, harried the Armada's flanks. They were like wolves nipping at the heels of a great bear. They could inflict damage, but they couldn't land a killing blow. The Spanish galleons were packed with soldiers. Their main tactic was to get close, grapple and board, where their superior infantry would win the day. The English, with their longer-range cannons and more manoeuvrable ships, wanted to stay at a distance and engage in artillery duels. The Armada anchored off the coast of Calais, waiting to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands. This was the critical moment. If Parma's battle-hardened troops could be ferried across the Channel under the protection of the Armada's guns, England was almost certainly doomed. And this is where the English turned to their own brand of desperate innovation. On the night of August 7th, they took 8 of their own ships, filled them with anything that would burn, pitch, tar, gunpowder, set them on fire, and sent them drifting with the tide and wind into the heart of the anchored Spanish fleet. These were the Hellburners. From a purely physical standpoint, they did very little damage, but psychologically, they were a masterpiece. To the Spanish sailors, who had heard terrifying tales of these fireships from the wars in the Netherlands, it was a vision of hell itself. Panic erupted. To escape the flames, Spanish captains cut their anchor cables, the one thing holding their perfect defensive formation together. The Great Crescent was broken. They were scattered. The next day, off the coast of Gravelines, the English fleet closed in. They now had the advantage they needed. They could use their superior speed and long-range guns to pound the disorganized Spanish ships which were now drifting helplessly, unable to reform. The battle was a brutal, day-long affair, but the real killer wasn't the English cannons, it was the weather. A powerful southwesterly wind began to blow, a wind so strong and so relentless that the Spanish sailors called it the Protestant wind. It prevented them from regrouping, it prevented them from taking shelter, and it pushed them inexorably north, past the coast of Scotland and into the vicious, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. Their great invasion was over. Their only hope was to circumnavigate the British Isles and try to get home. That journey home was a far greater disaster than the battle itself. Battered by storms, with their food rotting and their water casks shattered, the great ships of the Armada were wrecked upon the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Thousands of soldiers and sailors who had survived the English cannons drowned in the cold Atlantic surf. Of the 130 ships that had set sail with such pomp and ceremony, less than half made it back to Spain. England exploded in celebration. It was a miracle, a David and Goliath victory of biblical proportions. God, it seemed, was a Protestant after all. Queen Elizabeth's popularity soared. She had faced down the greatest power on earth, and won. But for one man, the celebrations would have felt hollow. For John White, the defeat of the Armada was not an ending, but merely the closing of one chapter of his nightmare. The stay of shipping was not immediately lifted. The war with Spain would drag on for years. The ships that had survived the battle needed repairs. The sailors needed to be paid. The national focus was on consolidating the victory, not on a tiny, insignificant colony on the other side of the world. The year 1588, the year he was supposed to return, came to an end. Winter set in. His colonists, if they were still alive, would have long since consumed the last of the supplies he had left them. Their hope, which had been pegged to the spring, would have curdled into doubt, then fear, then perhaps despair. The year 1589 dawned, and White was still in England. He was still petitioning, still pleading, still trying to organise a mission. Sir Walter Raleigh's attention, and more importantly his funds, were being diverted elsewhere. The Roanoke venture was beginning to look like a lost cause, a failed investment. The urgency that burned in John White's soul was a solitary fire. No one else felt it. To the rest of England, Roanoke was a distant memory, a footnote in a year of epic, nation-defining events. We can only imagine his state of mind. The crushing guilt, the sleepless nights spent staring into the darkness, his mind's eye filled with the faces of his daughter and granddaughter. He would have replayed his departure over and over. Had he said the right things? Had he reassured them enough? Did they know he was trying to come back? Or did they believe he had simply abandoned them? He, their governor, their leader, their father, was safe and sound in England, while they were facing starvation, disease, and the unknown dangers of a vast wilderness, all because of a king's pride and a queen's defiance. He was a man caught between two worlds. The old world, with its grand wars and titanic struggles for power, had reached out and swallowed his new world whole. The shadow of the Armada had fallen not just across the English Channel, but across the entire Atlantic, plunging the small settlement on Roanoke Island into a darkness from which it might never emerge. It would be another year before he found a way, not as the commander of his own relief expedition, but as a passenger, a guest on a privateering voyage that was heading to the West Indies and only agreed, reluctantly, to make a brief stop at Roanoke on the way home. It was now August of 1590. 3 years, 3 full years had passed since he had watched the figures of his family shrink on that sandy shore. An eternity. As he finally boarded the ship that would take him back, the hope that had sustained him for so long must have been a fragile, brittle thing. He was going back at last. But after 3 years of silence, of storms and of war, what and who would he find waiting for him? Chapter 5. Gone to Croatoan, the island of ghosts. And what he found was, first, the familiar, hostile coastline of the Outer Banks. This wasn't a simple matter of pulling into a harbour. The approach to Roanoke was, and still is, a masterclass in nautical anxiety, a labyrinth of shifting sandbars and treacherous shoals that the English sailors, with their deep-draught vessels, absolutely loathed. The ocean here is a fickle beast, and it seemed determined to make this final leg of the journey as difficult as possible. For days they were forced to anchor miles offshore, battered by winds and waves, staring at a hazy, indistinct shoreline that held all the answers in the world. Imagine that for a moment. After 3 years of agonizing waiting, of deals and delays, you are finally within sight of your destination. You can almost smell the pine and salt water of the island. Yet you're held captive by the weather, just out of reach. Each creak and groan of the ship's timbers must have sounded like a taunt. Every day that passed was another day for something to go wrong back on that island. The hope that had been so brittle was now being actively tested, stretched to its breaking point by the wind and the waves. The crew, merchants and privateers who had only agreed to this stop as a reluctant favour, were growing restless. Their patience was as thin as the morning fog. Finally, on the evening of August 17th, the weather broke just enough. The captain, likely with a heavy sigh, agreed to send a party ashore. White, his heart surely hammering against his ribs, climbed into a smaller boat with a handful of sailors. They couldn't head directly for the settlement site. It was too late in the day. The light was failing. Instead, they rowed towards a part of the island where they had seen a plume of smoke rising earlier, a smoke signal. It was the first sign of life they had seen, the first flicker of confirmation that someone, anyone, was there. The sailors began to call out, to sound a trumpet across the darkening water, playing familiar English tunes. They were announcing themselves, sending a message of friendly arrival into the oppressive humidity of the Carolina evening. And the response they received was nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses and the lonely cry of a seabird. The silence from the shore was absolute. It was a deep, profound emptiness that seemed to swallow the sound of their calls whole. They landed on the beach, weapons at the ready, and cautiously made their way towards the source of the smoke. Through the dense woods they pushed, the twilight deepening around them, until they came to a clearing, and there they found the fire. It was a bonfire, yes, but not a campfire. It was woods and grass, burning uncontrolled. There were no footprints around it, no signs of a camp, no half-eaten meal. It was just a fire, likely started by lightning or some other natural cause. A false positive, the 16th century equivalent of seeing the 3 little dots of a text message reply, only to have them disappear. The hope that had surged just moments before collapsed into a cold dread. They spent the night on the island, a sleepless, anxious night, firing muskets into the darkness from time to time, just in case. The only answer was the echo. The next morning, August 18th, his granddaughter Virginia's 3rd birthday, John White and his party finally made their way to the north end of the island, to the place where he had left his colony, the place he had been picturing in his mind for 1,095 days. As they approached the settlement site, the first thing they noticed was not what was missing, but what was new. A great defensive wall, a palisade, had been built around the perimeter of the settlement area. It was made of large tree trunks, sharpened at the top, dug deep into the earth. This wasn't a flimsy fence, it was a proper fort. This discovery must have sent a complex wave of emotions through White. Fear, certainly. A fortification like this meant they had felt threatened, but also a strange sense of relief. Building this would have taken time, organization, and a collective effort. This was not the work of a people surprised by a sudden attack. This was planning. This was foresight. It suggested they had control of their situation, at least for a while. They found an entrance, and as they passed through the gate into the enclosure, the true strangeness of the scene revealed itself. The village was gone. Not burned to the ground, not smashed to pieces. The houses, the small cottages that White had helped build, had been methodically, carefully taken down, dismantled. It was as if someone had packed up their entire life, but instead of just packing the boxes, they'd packed up the walls and the roof as well. The ground was overgrown with weeds, a clear sign that the place had been empty for some time. There was an eerie, profound sense of order to the abandonment. This wasn't a scene of chaos, it was a scene of departure. And then there was the most important discovery of all. What wasn't there? There were no bodies, no skeletons bleaching in the sun, no shallow graves, no signs of a battle, no bloodstains, no scattered weapons. The great fear, the one that must have kept White awake on so many nights, that of a surprise attack, a massacre that wiped everyone out, seemed mercifully to be unfounded. Whatever happened here, it wasn't that, nor did it seem to be a sudden plague that had carried them all away. The evidence pointed to a planned, orderly evacuation. They began to search the grounds, prodding the dirt, looking for any clue. They found a few things half buried in the earth. Heavy iron bars, some lead shot, 4 small cannons called falconets, heavy objects, things that would be incredibly difficult to transport without a proper boat. It was as if the colonists had packed everything they could possibly carry, their clothes, their tools, their food, their personal treasures, and left behind only the things that were too cumbersome to move. It all pointed to a single conclusion. They had left. willingly. But where? White had given them instructions before he'd left. A simple contingency plan. If they had to leave Roanoke for any reason, they were to carve their destination into a prominent tree or post, and if they were leaving under duress, in a state of emergency, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name. His men fanned out, their eyes scanning every tree, every post. And then, a shout. On a tree near the entrance, someone had found a carving. 3 capital letters, freshly cut but already weathered. CRO, just that. An abbreviation. Perhaps they were interrupted while carving it. The search intensified. A new energy running through the men. They knew they were close. And then they found it. On one of the main posts of the palisade gate, in a place no one could miss, was the full message. A single word, carved in clear Roman letters. Croatoan. White stared at the letters. Croatoan. There was no Maltese cross carved above it. No sign of distress. This was the message. This was the answer he had crossed an ocean and waited 3 years to find. Croatoan was not some mysterious unknown place. It was the name of the island, just to the south. Modern-day Hatteras Island. It was the home of Manteo, their trusted native ally. It was a place they knew, a place populated by friendly people. A wave of relief must have washed over John White, so powerful it might have buckled his knees. They weren't dead, they hadn't been captured. They had simply moved. They had gone to live with Manteo's people, a logical and sensible solution to their dwindling supplies and isolation. He wrote in his journal that he was greatly joyed by this discovery. The mystery, as far as he was concerned, was solved. His family was alive. His daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia. They were just 50 miles to the south. All he had to do now was go and get them. The plan was simple. They would return to the ships, sail south, and find the colonists at Croatoan. As they were returning to their boats, some of the sailors even began to sing. The mood had shifted from dread to elation. The long, grim search was over. A happy reunion was just a short voyage away. But the Outer Banks had one last cruel joke to play. As they tried to get back to the main ships anchored offshore, the weather, which had been merely uncooperative, turned vicious. The storm blew in with terrifying speed. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the sea rose up in a fury. One of the ship's main anchor cables broke, and they lost their primary anchor. The wind howled, and the waves crashed over the decks. They were in real danger of being wrecked on the very shoals they had so carefully avoided. For the privateer captain and his crew, this was the last straw. They had humoured the old governor, they had made his little side trip, but they were not about to lose their ship and their lives for a group of colonists who were, for all intents and purposes, safe. The decision was made. They could not risk an approach to Croatoan in this weather, with a failing anchor and a weary crew. Their next destination was the Caribbean, to hunt for Spanish treasure ships. John White pleaded with them. He argued. He probably offered them everything he had, but it was no use. The fleet was turning away. He stood on the deck of the ship as it pulled away from the coast, watching the hazy shoreline of the Outer Banks, the island holding the answer, the island of Croatoan, recede into the distance. He was 50 miles away from his family. After 3 years and thousands of miles, he was just a day's sail away, and yet he might as well have been on the other side of the world. He was being carried away by the current, watching the solution to the mystery, the location of his loved ones, shrink and finally vanish over the horizon. He would never set foot in the new world again. The message on the post Croatoan, which had been a beacon of hope, now became a signpost to a destination he could never reach, a permanent, tormenting testament to how close he had come. The island of ghosts had given up its secret, only for the sea to snatch it away at the last possible moment. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. The Croatoan Hypothesis. A theory of survival and assimilation was being carried away by the current, watching the solution to the mystery, the location of his loved ones, shrink and finally vanish over the horizon. He would never set foot in the new world again. The message on the post, Croatoan, which had been a beacon of hope, now became a signpost to a destination he could never reach, a permanent, tormenting testament to how close he had come. The island of ghosts had given up its secret, only for the sea to snatch it away at the last possible moment. And for John White, that is where the story ends. In failure, in heartbreak, in the salt spray of a storm that sealed the fate of his family from his own personal history. But for us, for the colonists themselves, that word carved into the wood was not an ending. It wasn't a lament. It was, in all likelihood, the beginning of the next chapter of their lives, That single stark word, Croatoan, was not a mysterious epitaph whispered by ghosts. It was a forwarding address, deliberately and carefully left by the living. Let's step back from the deck of that retreating ship, away from White's despair, and return to the quiet, empty settlement. Let's stand there in the silence, where the houses were being overgrown and the fort was being dismantled by nature. The colonists are gone, yes, but the clue they left is incredibly specific. It is perhaps the most important and least mysterious part of the entire affair. To understand it, we have to understand what that word meant to the people who carved it. It wasn't just a random place name pulled from a map. Croatoan was not a foreign concept. It was home. It was the home of their most steadfast, most trusted, and most crucial ally in this bewildering new world, Manteo. Manteo was a man of two worlds, a member of the Croatoan tribe from the island of the same name, what we now call Hatteras Island. He had sailed to England not once but twice. He had walked the muddy streets of London, learned to speak English, and met Queen Elizabeth I. He was the colonists' cultural attaché, their translator, their guide to the intricate politics and customs of the regional tribes. He was the one who had been baptized, christened Lord of Roanoke, and Dasamon Gapiak, by the English in a somewhat presumptuous, if well-meaning ceremony. He was, in short, their guy, their connection, their one reliable friend in a land that was proving to be far more complicated and far less welcoming than the promotional pamphlets back in England had suggested. So, when we see the word Croatoan, we must see it through their eyes. It's not a clue to a puzzle. It's the answer key. This brings us to the first, and perhaps most critical piece of evidence supporting this theory of survival, the prearranged plan. Before John White sailed for England in 1587, leaving his daughter, his granddaughter, and the entire colony behind, he had a very specific conversation with them. It was a contingency plan, a what to do in case of emergency protocol, born from the very real fear that they might have to move. The instructions were simple. If they had to leave Roanoke Island for any reason, they were to carve their destination into a prominent tree or post. And this is the crucial part. If they were leaving under duress, if they were being forced out by an attack, they were to add a Maltese cross above the name. It was their prearranged panic button, a signal of distress. When John White returned 3 years later, he found the word Croatoan carved into that palisade post, and he looked, with the eyes of a man desperate for any sign of trouble, for that cross. He says so himself in his account. He searched, and he found nothing. No cross, no signal of distress, just the name, just the destination. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a note left on the door, gone to the neighbours. 9. For White, this was a moment of profound relief. His heart, which must have been lodged in his throat as he walked through the silent settlement, could finally beat again. They weren't dead. They hadn't been attacked and dragged away. They had moved. They had followed the plan, and they had gone to the one place that made perfect sense, the one place where they might find genuine sanctuary, the home of their friend, Manteo, the home of the Croatoan people. So let's follow them. Let's leave the ghost island of Roanoke behind, and imagine the journey. The colony consisted of around 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children. This wasn't a small expeditionary force. It was a community, families, toddlers. They couldn't just pack a few bags and start walking. Roanoke Island is separated from Hatteras by the vast, shallow, and often treacherous Pamlico Sound. The journey would have been about 50 miles south. It would have required boats. Fortunately, the colonists had boats, not the great seafaring vessels that crossed the Atlantic, but smaller pinnaces and shallops, essential for exploring the sounds and rivers, for fishing, for moving between the islands. The decision to leave would not have been made lightly. It would have been the culmination of months of debate, of dwindling English supplies, of increasing anxiety as ship after ship failed to appear on the horizon. Perhaps their stores of lead shot for their muskets were running low. Perhaps the local tribes, once cautiously tolerant, were becoming more hostile as the English presence began to feel less like a visit and more like an occupation. The Croatoan, who had been their neighbours, had reason to distrust them after the actions of previous English expeditions. The balance of power was fragile. Imagine the final days at the Roanoke settlement. The decision is made. They will go to Croatoan. A current of purpose would have animated the colonists. The slow, careful work of dismantling their own homes would have begun, not in a panic, but with a methodical resolve. They weren't fleeing. They were relocating. They would have salvaged everything of value that they could carry. Nails, hinges, locks, tools, pewter dishes, pieces of armour. and of course their precious muskets and whatever ammunition remained. John White's own chests, buried for safekeeping, were a casualty of this move, dug up and ransacked, likely by local tribes after the colonists had gone, leaving his precious maps and books to the mercy of the rain. The colonists travelling light would have prioritized iron, food and weapons over the sentimental belongings of their absent governor. They would have loaded the pinnaces, distributing the weight of families and supplies. The children, perhaps confused but excited by the sudden activity, would be kept close. The livestock, any pigs or chickens they had managed to keep alive, would be trussed and loaded, and then a small flotilla of hope and desperation would have pushed off from the shore of Roanoke, leaving behind the first real attempt at an English life in the Americas. They would have navigated the complex channels of the Sound, with Croatoan guides, perhaps even Manteo himself showing them the way. The 50-mile journey might have taken days, island hopping, camping on beaches, always with a wary eye on the weather, which could turn the calm Sound into a churning nightmare in an instant. And then, they would have seen it, Croatoan, or modern-day Hatteras Island, a long, thin ribbon of sand, scrub, and maritime forest. To us, it's a vacation destination. To them, it was sanctuary. As their boats slid onto the beach, they would have been met not as invaders, but as guests. Refugees, perhaps, but refugees with a powerful sponsor in Manteo. They were arriving at a thriving community, a place that knew how to survive, and indeed thrive, in this environment. The real process of survival, the process of assimilation, would have begun here, and it's in the quiet, mundane details of this process that the story truly lies. Forget grand narratives of conquest or collapse. Think instead of the daily, awkward, and ultimately human interactions. An English woman, accustomed to baking bread in a clay oven, being taught by a Croatoan woman how to grind corn with a stone mano and metate, how to cook it into flatbreads on a hot rock by the fire. The texture, the taste, the very rhythm of preparing food would have been a lesson in a new reality. She, in turn, might have something to offer, a metal needle, the simple, miraculous technology of sewing with a durable, sharp, reusable point, a marvel to people who used bone awls, a small trade, a moment of shared knowledge, a bridge built between two worlds over a piece of cornbread, and a sewing lesson. Think of the Englishmen. Their agricultural skills were based on the fertile soils and predictable seasons of England. They brought wheat, which grew poorly in the sandy soil and humid heat. They were, in a very real sense, incompetent farmers in this new world. Now, they were living among masters of American agriculture. They would have learned about the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a symbiotic harmony that was a marvel of agricultural engineering. The corn providing a stalk for the beans to climb, the beans fixing nitrogen in the soil for the corn, and the broad-leafed squash providing ground cover, preventing weeds and keeping the soil moist. For a farmer from Devon, this would have been a revelation. His knowledge of crop rotation and ploughs was useless here. He had to unlearn centuries of English tradition and adopt a system perfected over millennia in this very place. In return, what could he offer? Perhaps the skill of a blacksmith, even a rudimentary ability to work metal, to repair a tool, to shape a piece of salvaged iron into a knife or an arrowhead, would have been seen as a powerful, almost magical skill. The housing would have been another immediate and stark difference. The colonists had built timber-framed houses in the English style at Roanoke, a style utterly unsuited to the climate. They were draughty in the winter and stifling in the summer. At Croatoan they would have lived in longhouses, arched structures of saplings, covered in woven mats or sheets of bark. These homes were airy, efficient, and perfectly adapted to the coastal environment. An English family, used to the privacy of separate rooms and the solidity of a wooden wall, would now find themselves living in a communal space, the sounds and smells of several families mingling with their own. The very concept of home, of personal space, would have to be renegotiated. Forget arguments over the thermostat. The goal was simply to be in a structure that didn't actively try to cook you in August or invite every single gust of wind to visit in January. And then there was the language. Communication would have been a constant, exhausting, and sometimes comical challenge. Manteo and a few others spoke some English, but the vast majority of the community spoke Carolina Algonquian. The colonists would have had to learn, word by painful word. The children, as children always do, would have picked it up first, becoming the little translators for their struggling parents, bridging the gap with the effortless grace of the young. Imagine an English father trying to ask for a fishing hook, resorting to pantomime. only to have his 7-year-old daughter casually step in and translate his request perfectly, before running off to play a game with her new Croatoan friends, a game whose rules he couldn't begin to understand. In that one small moment, you see the future. You see the beginnings of a new blended generation. Over the years, the lines would have blurred. English clothes, made of heavy wool and linen, would wear out. They would be replaced by the practical deerskin and woven fibers of their hosts. Diets would change permanently. The reliance on hunting and fishing, guided by Croatoan expertise, would become total. Religious practices would have faded or merged. A Christian prayer might be whispered over a sick child, followed by the intervention of a shaman with his own knowledge of local medicinal herbs. Old certainties would crumble in the face of new realities. And of course, there would be love. Intermarriage wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. A young English bachelor, a soldier or a farmer far from home, would fall in love with a Croatoan woman. They would marry, have children. An English widow might find companionship and security with a Croatoan man. These children would be the true inheritors of this blended world. They would carry English surnames but speak an Algonquian language. They might have their mother's dark hair and their father's blue eyes. They would know the stories of King Henry VIII and the legends of the Croatoan gods. They would be something new, a living testament to the Roanoke colony's survival. They did not vanish. They were absorbed. They assimilated. They became, for all intents and purposes, Native American. This theory, as tidy and as human as it sounds, would be mere speculation if not for the tantalizing clues that surface in the historical record over the next century and a half. The colonists fade from the English view, but they seem to reappear, like ghosts in the machine of history, in the accounts of later explorers. In 1701, over 100 years after the colony was lost, an English surveyor and explorer named John Lawson travelled through the coastal regions of North Carolina. He spent a great deal of time on Hatteras Island, living among the Hatteras Indians, the descendants of the Croatoan tribe, and he noticed something remarkable. He wrote in his book A New Voyage to Carolina that the Hatteras people were different. He noted that many of them had grey eyes, a feature unheard of among the purely Native American populations of the region, but common in England. He wrote that they value themselves extremely for their affinity to the English, and are ready to do them all friendly offices. He also claimed, and this is extraordinary, that several of them had English surnames, and that their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book. This is a stunning piece of anecdotal evidence. Lawson, with no particular reason to invent such a story, is describing a people who seem to have a living memory, an oral tradition of having absorbed a group of English newcomers. The ability to talk in a book, to read, was the one skill that would have set the colonists apart more than any other. It was a unique cultural marker, and the memory of it, it seems, had survived for over a century. Lawson's account is the strongest historical echo we have of the colonists, but it is not the only one. Throughout the 17th century, there were whispers and rumours. Reports from other native tribes told of people further inland who lived in 2-story stone houses, something the local tribes did not build, and who had European features. William Strachey, a secretary in the Jamestown colony, wrote in 1612 that the natives had told him of a group of Englishmen who had escaped a slaughter at Roanoke and were living under the protection of a chief named Eonoko, somewhere up the Chowan River. These stories are all second-hand, filtered through translators and the prejudices of the time, but they paint a consistent picture. The colonists survived the initial years and scattered, assimilating into various communities. The group that went to Croatoan was likely just one, albeit the largest of these survivor populations. The story then goes quiet for a long time, becoming a folk tale, a mystery to be debated by historians. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, a new kind of explorer arrived on Hatteras Island, the archaeologist, and with shovels and screens, they began to find physical evidence that supports what John Lawson saw and what the Croatoan hypothesis suggests. Archaeological digs, particularly at a site known as Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, have uncovered a fascinating mix of artifacts. The site was clearly a large Croatoan village, occupied for centuries, but mixed in with the native pottery shards and shell tools. Archaeologists have found objects that have no business being there. A piece of a German stoneware jug from the 16th century, the handle of a rapier, a gentleman's sword, a small decorative copper ring, a piece of lead from a writing slate pencil, a gun flint. These are not trade goods which tend to be more common items like beads or axes. These are personal, domestic, everyday objects that would have belonged to English colonists. And they were not found in a layer of ash, suggesting a raid. They were found in the context of everyday village life, mixed in with the debris of Croatoan homes. It paints a picture of cohabitation, an English gentleman's rapier hilt being discarded in the same trash pit as a broken clay pot made by a native woman. It's the small discarded junk of a blended household. More recently, work by the Croatoan Archaeological Society has continued to unearth compelling evidence. They've found pieces of borderware and North Devon plain, types of English pottery common in the 16th century. They've found fragments of crucibles used for metallurgy, suggesting someone was working with metals, a European skill. They've even found a small gold signet ring, engraved with the image of a prancing lion or horse, a very personal, very high-status European object, to be lost in a native village 50 miles from Roanoke. Each artifact on its own could be explained away as a product of trade or scavenging, but taken together, found in the same village, they form a powerful constellation of evidence. They are the physical footprints of the colonists, not in a new English settlement, but within the heart of a Croatoan one. The archaeology seems to confirm the story. They came here, they lived here, they brought their belongings with them, and they gradually became part of the community. And this brings us to another powerful and deeply personal piece of the puzzle, the oral tradition of the Lumbee people. The Lumbee are a Native American tribe of over 55,000 people, concentrated primarily in Robeson County, North Carolina, about 100 miles inland from Roanoke. For centuries, the Lumbee have maintained a steadfast oral history that they are the descendants of the Roanoke colonists, mingled with the Croatoan and other local tribes. Their traditions speak of their ancestors finding the English, offering them sanctuary, and eventually merging with them. For the Lumbee, this is not a theory, it is a cornerstone of their identity. They point to the prevalence of English surnames among their people, since they were first documented by Europeans. Surnames like Dare, Cooper, Harvey, and Jones, which were the very names on the list of 1587 colonists. They point to linguistic quirks in their dialect, turns of phrase that some linguists have suggested echo Elizabethan English. This connection is, it must be said, a subject of intense academic and political debate. Proving a direct, unbroken genetic line over 400 years is incredibly difficult, and the Lumbee's quest for full federal recognition as a tribe has been fraught with challenges related to this very issue. But we are not here to rule on federal recognition. We are here to listen to the echoes of the past. And the Lumbee tradition is a powerful echo. It is a story of survival and welcome that has been passed down from generation to generation, a living history that runs parallel to the written records of the English. It suggests that the assimilation on Croatoan was only the beginning, and that as pressures from new waves of European settlement grew, this blended community moved inland, up the rivers, seeking refuge and preserving their unique identity in the swamps and forests of the interior. Whether you view it as literal history or as a foundational myth, the Lumbee narrative provides a powerful human answer to the question of what happened. They say the colonists weren't lost, they were found, they were welcomed, and they live on, in the faces and the stories of their descendants. So, let's weigh the Croatoan hypothesis. The evidence in its favour is substantial. You have the pre-arranged plan, explicitly stated by John White. You have the lack of the distress signal. You have the colonists' deep and trusting relationship with Manteo and his people. You have the later historical account from John Lawson describing grey-eyed, English surnamed Indians on Hatteras Island. You have the modern archaeological evidence of European domestic items found within the main Croatoan village site. And you have the enduring oral tradition of the Lumbee people. What are the arguments against it? Mostly, they boil down to a lack of absolute, definitive proof. A smoking gun, as it were. No one has ever found a gravesite with European bodies. No one has found a document written by a colonist after 1587. There is no single incontrovertible piece of evidence that says, Eleanor Dare lived here and died here. The chain of evidence is circumstantial. Each piece can be questioned. Maybe the Maltese cross was there, and White missed it in his haste. Unlikely, but possible. Maybe Lawson was exaggerating, or misinterpreting what he saw. Maybe the artifacts on Hatteras were all from trade or a shipwreck. Maybe the Lumbee tradition is a more recent invention, a way to explain their unique heritage. These are all valid points of skepticism. History is not a courtroom, and we cannot prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, but we can weigh the probabilities, and the probability that a desperate, starving colony would choose to move 50 miles to live with their only known, powerful and trusted allies seems incredibly high. It is by far the most logical, the most plausible, and the most evidence-based explanation for what happened. It requires no sea monsters, no alien abductions, no secret Spanish raids. It requires only that we believe the colonists were rational people, acting in their own best interest, making the only sensible choice available to them. The great irony of the lost colony is that they probably weren't lost at all. Not to themselves, anyway. They knew exactly where they were. They were on Croatoan Island, beginning the slow, difficult, and ultimately successful process of building a new life. A life so completely different from the one they had left behind that, in a few generations, they would become unrecognizable to the English world that had abandoned them. They weren't lost. They were just gone. Gone from the map of the British Empire. Gone from the ledger of colonial ventures. They had stepped off the page of English history and into the story of America, a story that had been unfolding for millennia before their arrival and would continue long after. They vanished not because they died, but because they lived. They survived so completely that they disappeared into the very fabric of the world they had come to conquer, and in a way that is a far more remarkable and a far more interesting story than any ghost tale could ever be. It is the story of a message left on a wooden post, a message of hope, a forwarding address to a new beginning. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Lost in the Mainland. Theories of conflict and division. But what if that forwarding address wasn't the only one? What if the message on the post was just one part of a much more complicated and much messier story? Humans, after all, are rarely so neat and tidy. We don't always move in a single orderly group, leaving a clear note for anyone who might come looking. Sometimes plans fall apart. Sometimes disagreements that have been simmering for months boil over. And sometimes the world outside the safety of the palisade proves to be far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone could have possibly imagined. The idea of the entire colony, every man, woman and child, packing up and moving 50 miles down the coast to live with their friends, the Croatoan, is a comforting one. It's a story of unity and successful adaptation, but there are other whispers, other clues scattered through the historical record and etched onto old maps that suggest different paths were taken, paths that led not to a welcoming island, but into the deep, intimidating heart of the mainland. Paths that may have ended not in assimilation, but in conflict and division. Let's gently set aside the hopeful image of a unified colony for a moment, and consider a more fractured possibility. Let's imagine the state of mind of those 117 souls as the autumn of 1587 bled into winter. John White is gone. The promised relief has not arrived. Supplies are dwindling, and the gnawing uncertainty is becoming a constant, unwelcome companion at every meagre meal. Fear, as it so often does, begins to fray the edges of community. Not everyone would have agreed on the Croatoan plan. Some, perhaps the more cautious or the more fearful, might have seen leaving the relative security of the fort they had built as an unacceptable risk. Others, more bold or more desperate, might have argued for a different course of action entirely. Why go south to an island when the vast, resource-rich mainland lay just across the sound to the west? It's not hard to imagine the arguments held in hushed, tense tones around a smoky fire. Debates over Manteo's reliability, over the wisdom of putting their trust in any single native group, over whether it was better to stay put and pray for White's return, or to take their fate into their own hands. In this scenario, the colony doesn't move as one. It splinters, like a family arguing over a destination for a trip they can no longer afford. They break apart. Perhaps a large contingent, the majority, does indeed go to Croatoan, leaving the simple message on the post. But another group, maybe a handful of families, convinced that true safety lies in disappearing into the vastness of the continent, packs what they can carry and heads west. They would have paddled across the shallow, brackish waters of the Albemarle Sound, their small boats low in the water, their faces turned toward a shore that promised both sanctuary and unknown peril. This theory, the idea of an inland migration, isn't just idle speculation. It is rooted in a fascinating and tangible piece of evidence, John White's own map. The map, drawn by White himself, is a beautiful work of art and a vital historical document. It shows the coastline of North Carolina, with remarkable detail for the time. For centuries, it was studied, admired, and preserved. But in 2012, researchers at the British Museum decided to look at it a little differently. They weren't just looking at what was on the surface of the vellum. They were trying to see what might be underneath. Using modern imaging techniques, everything from transmitted light to X-ray spectroscopy, which sounds far more complicated than our simple act of just closing our eyes, they peered through the centuries, and they found something. Underneath a patch of paper, Deliberately glued over a specific spot on the map was a symbol, a faint four-pointed star, coloured in blue and red. It was the symbol used on English maps of the era to denote a fort. The location of this invisible fort was about 50 miles inland, at the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers, a place now known as Salmon Creek. Suddenly, a new possibility presented itself. Did John White know about a plan to move inland? Was this Site X, as it came to be known, a predetermined backup location, a rendezvous point, if the coastal settlement became untenable? The 50-mile distance is crucial. It aligns almost perfectly with the oral tradition of the Hatteras people, who told later explorers that the colonists had moved 50 miles into the country. It suggests a plan, a deliberate choice. The colonists weren't just wandering aimlessly. They may have been heading for a specific pre-scouted location. Let's journey with this hypothetical group for a moment. They've crossed the Sound. They are now on the mainland, a world away from the sandy, windswept shores of Roanoke Island. Here, the landscape is different. The air is heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. The forest is a dense, bewildering labyrinth of cypress, oak, and tupelo gum trees, their branches draped in Spanish moss that hangs like grey, skeletal fingers. The silence is profound, broken only by the chirping of unseen insects, the distant call of a bird, or the startling snap of a twig underfoot. For people used to the open fields of England, this was an intimidating, almost suffocating environment. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be a predator. They had no compass to speak of, beyond the sun and stars. They were navigating by instinct, by the flow of the rivers, and by whatever information they had managed to glean from Manteo or other friendly natives before they left. Their goal, this Site X, was not empty territory. They were venturing into the heart of the Algonquian world. This wasn't a single unified kingdom, but a complex and shifting tapestry of different nations, each with its own chief, its own traditions, and its own political allegiances. Near the coast were the Chowanoke, a powerful and numerous people. Further inland were others, like the Weetmeoke, and even further west along the rivers of the interior were the Tuscarora, who were not Algonquian at all, but Iroquoian-speaking. A different culture with a different language. The colonists, in their woolen clothes and leather shoes, would have been walking into a geopolitical landscape as intricate and as dangerous as any in Europe. The difference was, they couldn't read the signs. A friendly gesture from one group could be a mortal insult to another. Accepting the hospitality of one chief could make them the sworn enemy of his rival. It was like trying to navigate the complex social politics of a new office. Except here, a misunderstanding wouldn't just lead to an awkward encounter at the water cooler. It could lead to annihilation. Did they make it to Site X? Archaeological work has been ongoing in the area for years. Teams from the First Colony Foundation have been painstakingly excavating, sifting through the soil for any clue, any fragment of English life, and they have found things, not a fort, not the remains of a village, but tantalizing hints, shards of pottery known as Surrey Hampshire borderware, a type of ceramic used by the English middle class in the late 16th century, and completely out of place in a native village, a small piece of a rapier hilt, a metal hook for stretching hides, a flintlock mechanism from an early firearm. These aren't definitive proof, they are whispers. A single piece of pottery could have been acquired through trade, but taken together, they suggest a European presence in that exact area, at that exact time. Perhaps this small breakaway group did reach the confluence of the rivers. They might have built a small fortified settlement, a humble collection of huts surrounded by a simple palisade, hoping to live quietly, to farm, to survive. They would have been utterly isolated, a tiny island of Englishness, in a vast Native American sea. Their survival would have depended entirely on their ability to form relationships with their new neighbours. If they allied themselves with the right people, they might have stood a chance. They could have traded their metal goods and knowledge for food, protection, and local expertise. Slowly, over years, their English identity would have begun to blur. They would have adopted native farming techniques, learned to hunt in the dense forests, and perhaps even intermarried. Their children would have grown up speaking a mixture of English and Algonquian, comfortable in both worlds. Over a generation or two, they would have simply been absorbed. Their story would end not with a dramatic vanishing, but with a quiet, gradual fading into the local population. They wouldn't be the lost colony anymore. They would just be people, their English heritage becoming a distant memory, a story told by grandparents to wide-eyed children around a fire. But this peaceful scenario depends on everything going right, and in the precarious world of the 16th century American wilderness, things rarely went right. What if they chose the wrong allies? What if they inadvertently settled on land that was sacred or contested? Or what if their very presence, with their strange clothes, their powerful weapons, and their foreign diseases, was simply too disruptive for the local balance of power? This brings us to a darker, more violent theory. A theory that comes not from the quiet coasts of North Carolina, but from the next, more famous English attempt to colonize America, 2 decades later, and 100 miles to the north. It is the story told by the colonists of Jamestown. To understand this theory, we have to shift our focus away from Roanoke and travel forward in time to the year 1607. A new group of Englishmen arrives in the Chesapeake Bay. This is not a colony of families like Roanoke. It is a commercial venture, staffed primarily by soldiers, gentlemen adventurers and craftsmen, all hoping to find gold and get rich. They establish a settlement, Jamestown, on the banks of a river, in the heart of a powerful and sophisticated political entity known as the Powhatan Confederacy. The paramount chief of this confederacy was a shrewd, powerful, and at times ruthless leader named Wahunts-na-Kah, whom the English simply called Powhatan. Chief Powhatan ruled over some 30 distinct tribes, a population of thousands, covering a vast territory. He was an emperor in his own right, a master of diplomacy, trade and warfare. When the English arrived and built their fort in his territory, he viewed them with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and strategic calculation. Were they a threat to be eliminated, or were they a potential asset, a source of powerful new weapons and trade goods that could be used to consolidate his own power over his rivals? For years, the relationship between the Jamestown colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy was a tense dance of diplomacy, trade, and sporadic, brutal violence. It was in this charged atmosphere that the English began to ask questions about the colonists who had come before them, the ones who had settled at Roanoke. The story that emerged from these inquiries was chilling, according to several accounts recorded by the Jamestown settlers, most notably by Captain John Smith, and another writer named William Strachey. Chief Powhatan himself had confessed to ordering the slaughter of the Roanoke colonists. The reason, he allegedly claimed, was that the Roanoke settlers had left their island and gone to live with one of his rival tribes, the Chesapeake, who lived to the south of his core territory, Powhatan. So the story goes, had been warned by his priests that a nation would arise from the Chesapeake Bay that would threaten his empire. Seeing these strange, pale-skinned people aligning with his enemies, he decided to eliminate the threat before it could grow. In a preemptive strike, he sent his warriors to attack. William Strachey's account, written around 1612, is the most detailed and disturbing. He claims that Powhatan told him he had personally been at the slaughter, and that he possessed several artifacts taken from the English dead, including a musket barrel and an iron pot. According to this version of events, the colonists were not lost at all, they were exterminated. It's a brutal, grim explanation, and it seems on the surface to tie up the loose ends of the mystery. It explains why no one was found. It provides a motive, rooted in the political realities of the time. But like everything else in the Roanoke saga, it's not that simple. We have to look at this story not as an objective news report, but as a piece of information that served a purpose. Think about the context. By the time these stories were being recorded, the relationship between Jamestown and the Powhatan was deteriorating rapidly. The English were struggling to survive, constantly demanding food and land from the natives. The natives were growing tired of these demanding, aggressive newcomers. John Smith, a key source for this theory, was a brilliant but notoriously self-aggrandizing figure. His accounts of his own adventures, including his famous rescue by Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, are often embellished for dramatic effect. He was also a pragmatist who believed that the only way to deal with the native population was through strength and intimidation. A story about Powhatan slaughtering a previous group of English colonists was, to put it mildly, excellent propaganda. It painted Powhatan as a treacherous savage, justifying English aggression against him. It was a useful horror story to tell new arrivals and to write back home to investors in London, a way of saying, this is the kind of man we are dealing with. We need more soldiers, more guns, more support, if we are to succeed where the Roanoke colony failed. Furthermore, the story is entirely second-hand. We don't have Powhatan's testimony. We have what the English, his enemies, said he said. It's like hearing a story about a corporate takeover from a disgruntled employee who was just fired. You might get some of the facts right, but the narrative is going to be heavily slanted. Did Powhatan really confess to a mass killing to the very people who were trying to take his land? It seems unlikely for such a savvy political operator. It's more plausible that he might have told a story to intimidate the Jamestown colonists, to warn them what could happen if they stepped out of line. Or perhaps the English simply misunderstood a more complex story. Their translations clumsy, their understanding of local politics hopelessly naive. They might have heard a story about a battle that involved some strangers, and through a combination of fear and confirmation bias, twisted it into a full-blown massacre of their countrymen. There is also the archaeological evidence, or rather, the lack of it. A battle or a massacre of over 100 people would leave a significant trace in the ground, skeletons with signs of trauma, caches of English artifacts, the burned remains of a village. To date, no such site has ever been found in the Chesapeake territory. The Powhatan theory remains a powerful and haunting story, but it is a story built on the words of biased men, recorded decades after the fact, in a context of open hostility. It is a ghost story told by the colonists of Jamestown to make sense of their own precarious existence and to justify their own actions. It feels too neat, too much like a convenient cautionary tale. This leaves us with a more nuanced and perhaps more realistic picture. It's unlikely that there is one single answer to what happened to the lost colony. The truth is probably a tapestry woven from all these different threads. The message Croatoan is too direct, too deliberate, to be a red herring. It's almost certain that a significant number of the colonists, probably the majority, did exactly what the message said. They went to live with Manteo's people on Croatoan Island. There, they would have slowly over the years assimilated. They would have married, had children, and their English identity would have gradually faded into a new, blended Hatteras English culture. Their legacy would be not in ruined forts, but in the DNA of their descendants, in snippets of oral tradition, in the faint echoes of English words in an Algonquian language. But it's equally plausible that the colony did not move as one. Perhaps a smaller group, whether due to disagreement or a prearranged plan, did indeed head west into the mainland. Their journey would have been perilous, their fate uncertain. They might have found a peaceful home with a welcoming tribe at Site X, their existence hinted at by those few shards of English pottery found buried in the North Carolina soil. Or they might have blundered into a conflict, their small number quickly overwhelmed, their story ending quietly in a forgotten skirmish on a riverbank. And it is also possible that some of the colonists, perhaps a foraging party or a small group that had settled with a mainland tribe, did fall victim to Powhatan's warriors. The story told at Jamestown might not have been a complete fabrication, but a distorted account of a real, smaller-scale tragedy. A handful of Roanoke survivors, living with the Chesapeake tribe, could have been killed in one of Powhatan's raids. Their deaths and the discovery of their English-made possessions could have been the seed from which the larger tale of a full-scale massacre grew. So the colonists are not lost in one place. They are scattered across the islands and the riverlands of coastal North Carolina. Some are living peacefully on Croatoan, learning to fish with weirs and speak a new language. Others are struggling to survive 50 miles inland, their children growing up with no memory of England, and a few, tragically, may have met a violent end at the hands of a powerful chief protecting his empire. The mystery endures not because there is no answer, but because there are too many answers. The colony didn't just vanish, it dissolved, breaking apart and seeping into the landscape and the peoples of this new world in a dozen different ways. This idea of a slow, quiet assimilation, of a blending of peoples rather than a dramatic disappearance, is where the modern search for the lost colony has focused its efforts. The clues are no longer sought only in the soil with trowels and brushes, but in the very blood of the people who live in the region today. This is the work of the Lost Colony DNA Project. It is a remarkable endeavour, an attempt to bridge the 400-year gap using the tools of modern genetics. The project seeks to find a genetic link, a faint but traceable signal, connecting living people to the 117 colonists who stood on that island so long ago. The process is slow and incredibly patient. It involves collecting DNA samples, primarily from people whose family trees and oral histories suggest a possible connection to the early coastal tribes or the colonists themselves. They are looking for specific European mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome signatures that are rare in the general population but were present among the colonists. It's like searching for a single grain of English sand on a vast American beach. The researchers compare these modern samples to DNA extracted from archaeological remains in England, trying to find a match, a genetic echo from the past. The work is fraught with challenges. The genetic trail is faint, diluted over 15 generations. Family histories can be unreliable, stories changing with each telling. But the project represents a profound shift in how we think about the colony. It frames the story not as one of failure and death, but of survival and legacy. It honors the possibility that the colonists didn't die out, but lived on, their contribution woven into the fabric of American families who may not even know the full story of their own origins. For the people who participate, it is a deeply personal quest. It's a search for identity, for a connection to one of America's oldest and most romanticized mysteries. Imagine living your whole life in eastern North Carolina, hearing the stories of the lost colony, and then discovering through a simple DNA test that you might be a direct descendant of Eleanor Dare or of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. It would transform a piece of history into a piece of your own story. To date, the DNA project has not found a definitive smoking gun link. There has been no eureka moment where a living person's DNA has been matched perfectly to a colonist, but it has uncovered tantalizing clues, genetic markers that suggest a mixing of European and Native American populations in that specific region at that specific time. It is adding a new, deeply human layer to the story. It reminds us that history is not just about dates and events and the actions of famous men. It is about families, about survival, about the quiet, anonymous lives of ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. It's about the fundamental human drive to endure, to adapt, and to create a future for one's children, even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. The fate of the Roanoke colonists, then, ceases to be a simple question of what happened to them, and becomes a much more profound question of who did they become. The answer isn't a single event, but a process of fragmentation, of migration, of assimilation, and of conflict. Some found a new home, some found a grave, but it is very likely that many of them simply found a new life, a life so completely integrated into the world they had entered that their old one was lost to history. They disappeared not into thin air, but into the deep, resilient, and complex tapestry of America itself. And so the search continues, not just for a lost colony, but for the lost threads of a story that is still being woven, in the land, in the archives, and in the very DNA of the people who call that coast home. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the most enduring way to survive is to be willing to change, to let go of the old world and embrace the new, even if it means being lost to the history books, only to be found, centuries later, in the quiet truth of a family tree. And as we let these possibilities drift and settle, the stark horror of a massacre and the quiet hope of a new beginning find a strange and peaceful coexistence, two sides of a story that may never be fully told, a perfect mystery to carry us into the silence of our own dreams. Chapter 8: The Modern Search, Archaeology, Dendrochronology, and the Unending Quest. But of course, we humans are a restless bunch. We find it almost impossible to let a perfect mystery lie. The silence is too loud, the unanswered question too tempting. A story that may never be fully told is less of a comfort and more of a challenge. And so, where the trail of John White went cold, where history closed its books with a quiet sigh, we eventually returned, not with ships and sailors, but with shovels, trowels, and sciences that the colonists themselves would have mistaken for the darkest of magics. We came back to try and coax the story from the earth itself, to ask the silent soil what it remembers. Because while a story can be lost to the page, its echoes can linger in a shard of pottery, a rusted nail, or the very rings of a 1,000-year-old tree. The search for the lost colony never truly ended. It just went quiet for a few centuries, waiting for us to invent the right tools to listen again. The initial forays back to Roanoke Island in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were fueled by a kind of romantic fervour. This was the era of historical pageants and a burgeoning American identity, and the lost colony was a perfect founding myth. Tragic, mysterious, and undeniably ours. The first investigators, men like Talcott Williams, were driven by passion and a healthy dose of patriotic curiosity. They came to the island, paced its shores, and poked around with a sort of hopeful enthusiasm. They found the remains of an old earthwork, a fort, which seemed to fit John White's description, and for a time that felt like enough. They could stand within its faint outline, look out at the sound, and imagine the whole sad drama playing out. It was more about feeling the history than excavating it. The island itself was the monument. But feelings, as we know, are not facts, and as the 20th century progressed, the new and disciplined science of archaeology began to cast a more critical eye on Roanoke. The problem, archaeologists soon discovered, is that history is messy, people are messy. We live, we build, we discard, we tear down, and we build again, often right on top of our own forgotten foundations. Roanoke Island wasn't a pristine time capsule sealed in 1587. It had been continuously inhabited. There were Native American settlements long before the English ever saw it. After them came farmers, fishermen, a freedmen's colony during the Civil War, and eventually the very infrastructure of the modern world. Imagine trying to find a single, specific dropped stitch in a blanket that has been repaired, re-dyed, and rewoven by a dozen different hands over 400 years. That's the challenge of Roanoke archaeology. The first truly professional excavations, led by Jean-Carl Harrington in the 1940s, were a masterclass in this frustration. His team worked with painstaking care, meticulously digging square by square, sifting every handful of dirt. They were looking for the settlement, for the cottages and workshops that must have been built. They were hunting for post holes, the dark circular stains in the soil that are the ghostly footprints of long-vanished wooden posts. Finding a pattern of post holes could reveal the shape of a house, a wall, a life. And they found things, of course. They uncovered the footprint of a workshop, complete with a small charcoal-filled pit that had clearly been used for metallurgy. An English blacksmith had stood here, in the suffocating heat of a Carolina summer, working his forge. They found shards of pottery, the everyday plates and jugs of the colonists. They found a snaffhaunce lock from an early firearm, a piece of armor, a sickle. Each piece was a tiny, tangible connection to a ghost. You could hold it in your hand and know that someone in that fated colony had held it too. It was thrilling, but it was also maddeningly incomplete. The biggest problem was that everything they found was concentrated around that one earthwork, the structure we now call Fort Raleigh. But John White's colonists, all 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children, couldn't have all lived inside a small defensive fort. There had to be a village, the Kitty of Raleigh. Where were the houses? Where were the wells? Where were the graves? Harrington and his team searched and searched, expanding their digs, but the settlement itself remained stubbornly invisible. It was as if the colonists had lived and worked entirely within the fort, and then simply evaporated. The earth around it was frustratingly silent. It led to a rather deflating conclusion, that the main settlement, the actual town, had probably been lost to the very thing that makes the Outer Banks so beautiful and so treacherous, the water. The water, the shoreline of Roanoke Island, is not a fixed thing. It is constantly being reshaped by the patient, relentless work of the waves and the wind. Geologists have shown that the northern end of the island, the most likely spot for a deep water landing and a settlement, has eroded dramatically over the centuries. It's entirely possible that the Kitty of Raleigh, with all its secrets, now lies in 100 scattered pieces beneath the placid surface of the Roanoke Sound. The main prize, the historical jackpot, might have been washed away before the science to find it even existed. Time, and the tide, had conspired to keep the secret. And so for decades the archaeology on Roanoke Island felt like a hunt for crumbs. Important crumbs, to be sure, but crumbs nonetheless. The evidence confirmed that the colonists were there, but it couldn't tell us where they went. It felt like a dead end, a cold case where the crime scene itself had been wiped clean by the elements. The story, it seemed, would have to remain in the realm of speculation, a favourite topic for documentaries and history books, but not for the hard science of dirt and artefacts. But science is rarely content with a dead end. If you can't find the answer in one place, you simply start looking for a new place to ask the question, or, in this case, a new kind of witness to interview. The breakthrough didn't come from a shovel, but from a drill. It came not from the soil of Roanoke Island, but from the heartwood of ancient trees, living chronicles that had stood silent sentinel over the entire affair. This is the remarkable science of dendrochronology, which is the polite, academic way of saying tree ring dating. It's a beautifully simple concept. Every year, a tree adds a new layer of growth, a new ring, just beneath its bark. In a good year, with plenty of rain and mild temperatures, that ring is wide and healthy. In a bad year, a year of drought and struggle, the ring is thin and starved. A tree, therefore, is a living library of the climate. Its rings are a year-by-year, unblinking record of flood and fire, of feast and of famine, written in the language of wood. In the 1990s, a team of scientists from the University of Arkansas traveled to the swamplands of North Carolina and Virginia. They knew that the bald cypress trees growing in the region were among the oldest living things on the east coast. Some of them were saplings when Columbus sailed. Many were already ancient when the first English ships dropped anchor at Roanoke. Using a tool called an increment borer, a hollow drill bit, they extracted thin, pencil-like cores from these living giants, samples that stretched from the bark to the very heart of the tree without causing any permanent harm. Back in the lab, they began to read the story the trees had to tell. By cross-referencing the patterns of thick and thin rings from hundreds of trees, they built a master timeline of the region's climate stretching back centuries, and when they got to the years 1587, 1588, and 1589, the exact period the lost colony was trying to survive, the rings told a harrowing tale. They became suddenly, terrifyingly thin. The trees were screaming of a thirst so profound, a sky so relentlessly empty, that the very landscape must have felt like it was dying. The data revealed that the colonists had arrived on the shores of the New World at the absolute worst possible moment. They had sailed into the teeth of the most extreme drought the region had experienced in over 800 years. This wasn't just a dry spell, this was a catastrophic multi-year environmental disaster. The corn wouldn't grow, the rivers would have become sluggish and salty, the forests, usually a bounty of nuts, berries and game, would have withered. The local tribes, the Secatan and the Croatoan, who knew this land intimately, would have been struggling desperately for their own survival. Their stores would be low, their patience for a group of strange, demanding newcomers even lower. This single piece of scientific data changed everything. It reframed the entire story. The failure of the colony was no longer just a matter of poor planning, or bad leadership, or hostile natives. The colonists were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, and couldn't possibly understand. They were fighting the climate itself. The heavens had turned against them. Imagine the psychological toll. You flee an overcrowded, familiar England for a promised Eden, a land of supposed milk and honey, only to find yourself in a dust bowl. Every prayer for rain is met with a hard, blue, unforgiving sky. Your attempts at gardening, the very skills that defined an English life, are useless against the baked, cracked earth. The New World wasn't welcoming them. It was actively trying to kill them. The drought doesn't tell us where they went, but it gives us the most powerful why we've ever had. Why did they leave Roanoke Island? Because it had become a trap. A barren, freshwater-starved island was the last place you'd want to be. They had to move. They had to find a place with more reliable water, better hunting, a chance. The Croatoan carving was no longer just a clue. It was a desperate plan born of an existential crisis. But the drought also complicates the idea of them simply moving in with their native allies. The Croatoan themselves would have been under immense pressure. Could they really have afforded to take in and feed 100 extra mouths when they could barely feed themselves? It makes the story more desperate, more tragic, and infinitely more human. They weren't just lost, they were unlucky, on a scale that is almost biblical. This climatic revelation breathed new life into the search, suggesting that the most promising place to look for the colonists wasn't on Roanoke Island at all, but inland, up the rivers, where fresh water and more sheltered ground might be found. But where to even begin looking? The Carolina mainland is vast. A search without a target is just wandering. The next great clue, like the tree ring data, came not from the field but from a quiet, climate-controlled room, thousands of miles away, in the archives of the British Museum. There for centuries had lain a beautiful watercolour map of the region, drawn by John White himself. It's known as the Virginia Pars map. It is both a work of art and a vital historical document, showing the coastline, the islands, and the native villages as White saw them. For generations, historians and researchers had studied it, poring over every detail, and for generations they missed the secret it was holding. In 2011, researchers at the museum were examining the map with new technologies, not just the naked eye, but with powerful backlighting, X-ray spectroscopy, and multispectral imaging. They were, in essence, giving the map a full-body CAT scan. They noticed something odd. On the mainland, at the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers, about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island, were two small paper patches. They had been on the map for centuries, expertly applied to correct a mistake or cover a tear, a common practice for cartographers of the period. No one had ever thought much of them, but under the penetrating gaze of modern science, the patches gave up their ghost. Beneath one of them, faintly visible like a watermark, was the symbol of a fort, drawn in a different style from the others on the map, and seemingly deliberately hidden. A second, smaller symbol was located nearby, The fort symbol had been drawn in one kind of ink and then covered over with the patch, on which the surrounding rivers and landscape had been redrawn to hide it completely. Why would John White, or someone in his circle, draw a fort on his map and then take pains to conceal it? The location was tantalizing. It was 50 miles inland, a significant journey, but a logical one if you were seeking shelter from Spanish raiders on the coast, and a more stable environment away from the drought-stricken island. It matched, in a way, the old rumours and vague reports from the Jamestown settlers years later, who heard tales of Europeans living among the tribes up the Chowan River. Could this be the secret place of retreat that Governor Lane had planned for his earlier military colony? Could it be where a portion of White's colonists had decided to go? The hidden symbol wasn't a destination, it was a treasure map, and X literally marked the spot. This discovery launched a new era in the search for the lost colony. An archaeological team, led by Nicholas Lucchetti and the First Colony Foundation, focused their attention on the area indicated by the map. They called their primary search area Site X. It wasn't an island, but a quiet, unassuming plot of land in Bertie County, a place of sleepy fields and forests that had seen little but agriculture for centuries. The work was slow and methodical. This wasn't a hunt for stone foundations or dramatic ruins. They were looking for the same faint traces as on Roanoke Island, dark stains in the soil, and the tiny discarded artifacts of daily life. For a long time, they found very little. They found plenty of Native American artifacts, proving the site was an important one for the local tribes. But the English presence remained elusive. The soil was keeping its secrets. And then, one day, they found it. A tiny shard of pottery, no bigger than a thumbnail. But it wasn't the rough, dark pottery of the local tribes. This was different. It was a light-coloured earthenware with a distinctive green glaze on the inside. To the archaeologists, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was Surrey Hampshire borderware, a type of common, everyday pottery made in England and used throughout the Elizabethan era, and it had absolutely no business being on a remote bluff overlooking the Chowan River. Finding a piece of borderware at Site X is like finding a specific brand of 21st century artisanal coffee cup in the middle of an uncontacted jungle. It doesn't belong. Someone had to have brought it there. And then came more. A small piece of a stoneware German jug, a lead flint, a tiny copper aglet, the metal tip from a 16th century shoelace, a piece of a rapier hilt, a piece from the firing mechanism of an early English musket. None of these were spectacular treasures. They were the pocket lint of history, the small, disposable, forgettable items of life. But taken together, they painted an astonishing picture. Not only were these artifacts European, they were specifically English, and crucially, from the correct time period. They were a perfect match for the material culture of the Roanoke colonists. This was not, the archaeologists are careful to point out, the discovery of the lost colony. The number of artifacts is small, suggesting a temporary camp rather than a permanent settlement. This wasn't the city of Raleigh transplanted to the mainland. But it is, without a doubt, the most compelling evidence ever found of the colonists' presence after they left Roanoke Island. It suggests a small group, perhaps an advance party or a splinter group, made their way inland, exactly as the hidden map hinted they might. They lived there for a time, alongside a native community. They sat by their fires, they fixed their shoes, they cleaned their guns, and then, once again, they vanished from the archaeological record. The discovery at Site X has fundamentally changed the mystery. It shatters the idea of a single, unified fate for the colonists. They didn't all die on Roanoke. They didn't all sail away in a phantom ship. They didn't all march to Croatoan Island. The story is now messier, more complex, and more plausible. It's likely the colony fractured. Perhaps one group, the one we see evidence of at Site X, went inland to seek refuge. Perhaps another group, including Eleanor, Dare, and Virginia, did indeed go south to live with Manteo's people on Croatoan, now Hatteras Island. Perhaps other, smaller family groups scattered in different directions, seeking their own salvation. The mystery is no longer, where did the colony go, but rather, where did all the different parts of the colony go? It's a puzzle with multiple solutions. The modern search continues, armed with technologies that are evolving every year. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometers can now scan huge areas, creating digital maps of what lies beneath the soil. Without ever digging a hole, they can detect the faint magnetic signatures of old fire pits and the disturbed earth of buried walls, guiding archaeologists to the most promising spots with incredible precision. And then there is the most intimate science of all, genetics. For decades, the Lumbee people of North Carolina have passed down an oral tradition that they are, in part, descended from the lost colonists who intermarried with their native ancestors. For just as long, this claim has been met with a mixture of romanticism and skepticism. But DNA analysis offers a new way to test this old story. The challenge is immense. 4 centuries of intermarriage, migration, and the complexities of genetic inheritance make finding a clear, unbroken line back to a handful of English settlers incredibly difficult. But projects like the Lost Colony DNA project are attempting it, comparing the Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA of potential descendants against samples from known relatives of the colonists back in England. So far, the results are tantalizing but inconclusive, hints and whispers in the genetic code, and so the quest continues. It is a quiet, patient, and unending process. It's the work of archaeologists on their hands and knees in the Carolina humidity, of scientists peering at tree rings in a lab, of historians decoding faint marks on a 400-year-old map, of geneticists searching for a ghost in a genome. Each discovery doesn't so much solve the mystery as it does enrich it. It adds a new layer, a new possibility, a new complication. We know now about the terrible drought that shaped their choices. We have found their faint footprints 50 miles from where we thought they had vanished. We are, in a strange way, closer to them than ever before. We can feel the grit of the dry soil, understand the desperation in their decision to leave the island, and see the faint hidden hope in a secret mark on a map. But the central mystery, the human story of what happened to those 117 souls, remains just out of reach. We have found their things, but we have not yet found them, and perhaps that is how it is meant to be. The search itself has become the story. The Lost Colony is no longer just a historical event that happened in 1587. It is an active, ongoing investigation, a conversation between the present and the past, carried out with satellites and shovels. And as we settle in, as the sounds of our modern world fade away, we can imagine that quiet work, the gentle scrape of a trowel against the earth, the soft hum of a computer, analyzing data, the silent growth of an ancient tree, each is a form of listening, a patient attempt to hear a story that has been whispering just below the surface for centuries. The lack of a final, neat answer is not a failure, it is an invitation to wonder, to imagine, and to let the questions themselves, in all their beautiful, unresolved complexity, be the story that carries us into our own quiet oblivion, sifting through the layers of the day, searching for our own peace, a final, gentle resting place in the long and silent night.